Chapter 986. After saying this, Sulu closed his eyes again. Li Jadu looked at the hologram and saw Sulu trembling violently. His own body could not help but tremble slightly as well. He could not imagine or accept the fact that a human could directly control a warship. He clenched his right fist and shouted with a gloomy expression, "What are you waiting for? Open the door and kill him." At this time, Sulu had once again entered the world full of lines and dots of light. His consciousness and Jinshi were sometimes close to each other, and sometimes they were separated by heaven and earth. Wandering around the abstract three-dimensional warship, he could feel more and more clearly that his connection with the warship was getting closer and closer. His hand holding the data cable tightly, his consciousness was transmitted along with the data fragments on the line. He could not see where his consciousness was, but he knew where it was. This was a very strange feeling. He felt that he was this huge warship, and this warship was himself. Between the lines and dots, between light and darkness in that world, Sulu suddenly remembered that many years ago at Yua University, he had once listened to Professor Zhou's class on the structure of warships. That was when he was at his most youthful and delicate age. He had first fallen in love with the owner of the bag of dog biscuits. Then, because of the inexplicable shattering of his first love, he felt uneasy. But even in this state of mind, he still firmly remembered the content of that class. The Federation's warship and any complex mechanical system were composed of three major systems: the control system, the structure system, and the power system. Humans were also composed of these three major systems. The brain and nerve bundles were the control system. The bones, muscles, internal organs, hair, blood, and skin were the structure, and the natural things in the body became fat, blood sugar, and oxygen were the power. In that class, Professor Zhou had said that a mecha was a small warship. Sulu had silently thought that a human could be seen as a small mecha. Then, if he converted this formula, would a human be a small warship? Uncle said that humans were the first order of machines. Could this be what he meant? With the help of the Federal Central Computer, his consciousness was able to travel between the two worlds and directly enter the world full of electron streams and data fragments. Was it because the world of humans and the world of machines were not fundamentally different? What seemed like a long time of contemplation was actually just a thought in Su Li's mind. The biggest problem he was facing now was not a reflection of reality that only third-rate philosophers would be immersed in and might never be able to surface, but a real danger. He had to end this seemingly silent but extremely dangerous battle before his exhausted body collapsed and the internal injuries caused by the forced squeezing of his true chi broke out. He believed that after confirming that he had completely destroyed the information transmission system, even someone as reserved and cautious as Li Jadu would not wait any longer. At this time, there must be countless soldiers rushing over. They had to control this huge, scorching sun battleship in the shortest time possible so that the battleship could turn around and return to the Federation and return to the glory of the Charter as soon as possible. However, it was an extremely difficult task to accomplish. The difference in quantity was magnified exponentially. The difference between capturing and controlling a mecha and controlling a battleship was like the difference between pushing the rock in the mine pit in Donglin and pushing the snowy peak by Feiching Lake. Even the pulse signal of the central computer of the Federation was not strong enough to control a huge warship, not to mention that he was only one person after all. He had about the same weight, height, muscles, and blood. How much energy could he have if he burned all the bits and pieces of his body into energy? He held the data cable tightly with both of his hands and infused the bloodstained Jinshi that seemed to have been squeezed out from his bones. But he still couldn't gain full control of the battleship. His body was on the verge of collapsing at the moment, and he would probably die if he continued to control the battleship. In the end, he was still faced with the same multiple-choice question that he had repeated for almost 30 years. How should he choose between life and death on that dark, rainy night when he was a child? How should he choose between that mecha and the rainstorm of bullets in the underground parking lot of the Linhai State Gymnasium? How should he choose between the threat of the Federal Academy of Science and the wisdom left by Professor Shun in the Husk Institute? How should he choose between Li Wei, who was kidnapped as a hostage, and Macklin, who was about to escape? How should he choose between the desperate situation and the mission of activating the charter network on the peak of planet 3320? How should he choose between the dangerous and unknown left sky galaxy and the fleet that attacked the ancient bell? How should he choose between the pursuit of the entire Federation and the stubbornness of the wild grass in the underground water channel? For many people, these were extremely difficult multiple-choice questions. But Sula didn't even need to spend time thinking when facing these questions. Every time he found that he couldn't control other people or his world, he would destroy them in the most violent way. Many years later, the choices he made back then might not be absolutely correct, and there might be a better way to deal with them. However, Su Lu had no choice at the time. It was because he believed that those were things that couldn't be chosen in the first place. If he had chosen the more complicated and longer path, he would have been another Su Lu, rather than this stone Su Lu in the East Forest. From the beginning until now, he had never changed when he was the fugitive of the Federation and the crown prince of the Empire. As such, when he found that he couldn't control this battleship loaded with thousands of nuclear bombs, he chuckled and didn't care that his trembling feet were on the brink of death. He made a simple and even hasty decision. If he had to close his eyes forever, he would turn this battleship into a cold steel grave. In the dark world, the lights of various colors intertwined and formed innumerable light specks. Sula looked at the area that was obviously brighter than the surroundings and ascertained that it was the core of the Scorching Sun battleship, where the temperature was highest. Next to the core of the core was the complicated control chip structure, which was much more secure and powerful than the defense of the information transmission system. To destroy these chips required a stronger Jinchi and willpower. Jing Jiao held the thick data cable in his hand tightly, his body trembling violently, as if every cell in his body was burning and sacrificing their energy. His skin grew hotter and hotter, and the sweat dripping down his face evaporated instantly, forming a white column hanging over his head. As the scorching force like the lava was injected into the battleship, the data cable in his hand started twisting and bouncing in an eerie manner. Creaking sounds could be heard in the control panel. Whoosh! Sparks of electricity crackled in every direction, illuminating his pale face. Fresh blood seeped out from his ears and nostrils between his tightly closed eyelids and tightly pursed thin lips. It was then that a familiar smell appeared in the two worlds with completely different rules. The smell reminded Jing Jiao of his first dream of life and a conversation he had with his friend. When he was young, Jing Jiao had always wanted to be the assistant mechanic of that purple-haired girl captain. One day, he had lamented to himself that he was a guy who didn't know how to build, but only how to destroy, to Old Bai, to Tai Ziwan, or to the deceased Mr. Sher. He was now a talented mechanic. Standing in a remote room on the battleship of the Federation, he could enter the system of the battleship by holding two data cables. But he was surprised to find that what he was best at was not repair, but destruction. The electric sparks flew in all directions, illuminating his pale face and the fresh blood seeping out from the corners of his mouth and nostrils between his eyelids. The yellow light mixed with the red blood, as if his face was plated with a layer of gold. His trembling body could no longer squeeze out a single drop of sweat, and the capillaries under his skin showed signs of rupturing. Apart from the smell of blood that pervaded his body, he finally smelled a familiar scent. It was the scent of death. Sula had experienced too many life-and-death situations in the past 30 years, so he was familiar with the smell. As such, he didn't feel scared, and he didn't feel the sense of tragedy like many heroes sacrificing themselves in the dark. All he felt was contempt and disdain as he thought to himself, "This young master won't die, of course. This young master will never die." The group of crystal engines in the isolated area at the rear of the Scorching Sun battleship had a sudden change. Boom! The huge battleship shook violently, as if it had been hit by a huge meteorite. Many soldiers who couldn't stand still fell to the ground heavily, bleeding from their heads. The group of engines of the battleship didn't explode, and none of the engines stopped working. The feedback made the soldiers in the control hall feel a bit relieved, but soon they found that they had been relieved too early. The data screen in the control hall turned blue one after another. No matter how hard the operators tried, they couldn't send any instructions to the group of engines to do anything effective. The most important part of the battleship was the engine. Without the energy provided by the engine, the battleship would become an iron coffin drifting in the vast universe, no matter how large it was. Though the engine was still providing energy, it meant that the battleship couldn't adjust its course if it couldn't be operated. It could only fly on the current course like a rock until it collided with a planet and exploded or disappeared at the end of the universe. Some soldiers in the control hall couldn't withstand such a heavy mental blow after witnessing such a series of bizarre changes. They fell to the ground weakly, unable to get up again. The whole Scorching Sun battleship was in a state of chaos before the end of the world. Sulu, what have you done to this battleship? Lee Jae-do murmured this in a deep voice while staring at the room full of electric sparks on the screen and the face full of bloodstains and closed eyes amid the electric sparks. Sulu opened his eyes slowly. It seemed that he had heard this question. His exceedingly bright eyes returned to normal, and his shrunken pupils returned to normal. Besides his exceedingly pale face and a few frightening bloodstains, nothing else could be found on him. He loosened his trembling hands, and the two data cables dropped by his feet with a paw sound. He lifted his head and looked at the probe in the corner of the room with narrowed eyes. Since you insist that the direction you choose is always correct, I'll make sure that this battleship can't change its direction, he replied in a hoarse and deep voice. Chapter 987. The crystal engine cluster assembly device that looked like a giant tambourine vibrated slightly. The light relief valve designed by countless top scientists emitted a light blue light beam outside the ship. It was very beautiful. The violent vibration from before had already stopped. Other than spilling a few cups of coffee, the engine control room did not seem to have suffered any serious damage. However, the engineers and soldiers in charge of engine maintenance had abnormally nervous expressions on their faces. Their eyes were filled with confusion and even fear. The engine control console in the middle had been forcefully pried open. They looked at the chip that was emitting green smoke. They looked at the pipe that had been melted into a mess of sesame paste and vegetables in the distance. They looked at the emergency stabilizing alloy probe that weighed dozens of tons wedged between the steering wheels. When they thought of the serious consequences, their bodies could not help but tremble. Despair began to spread. In a room on the third floor of the battleship, Sulu raised his trembling arm with difficulty and wiped away the blood that was seeping out of his eyes, nose, and mouth. However, the blood smeared all over his face. He looked at the silent probe in the corner of the room and grinned, revealing a mouth full of neat teeth that were blood red due to the severe bleeding of his gums. At this moment, he looked like an ancient barbarian from the legends. After capturing the enemy, he would skin them alive, tear their flesh apart, chew them up, and swallow them into his stomach. He would then reveal a satisfied smile, giving off a terrifying feeling of cruelty mixed with naivety. Roar! He let out a strange cry at the probe. Dragging his bloody and wounded body, he ran out of the room. Hearing the faint footsteps of the heavy mecha coming from above, and hearing the shouts mixed with hurried breathing, he limped and dragged his legs as he awkwardly increased his speed. He looked like a comical and adorable penguin that was frightened. Rushing to the front of the charred MXD mecha, he did not immediately enter the cockpit. Instead, he picked up the repair arm that he usually felt was extremely light, but now felt extremely heavy. He used the fastest speed possible to forcibly open the turbine seal valve between the two engine systems behind the mecha's waist. However, he reached out and pulled out the military boot that had fixed the data cable from the one-way valve. His left hand pulled on a cable with force. With the sound of mechanical friction, the heavy alloy gate slowly opened. The space inside the ship suddenly lost pressure, and the air whistled and leaked out of the gate. At this moment, Sulu was already seated in Little White Flower's cockpit. His finger pressed the electronic control switch, and the mecha's twin engines roared to life. Due to the overload, they were starting up with a tearing sound. Coming from the back of the dimly lit cockpit, he did not hesitate at all and pushed hard on the control stick. The alloy door opened slowly, and when it was raised to a height of about 3 meters, the charred black MXT mecha suddenly paused and rushed towards the door. Just as it was about to crash into the door, it miraculously laid down on its mechanical legs like a drunkard lying down in the middle of the street without a care in the world. In the end, it miraculously managed to pass through the door without a moment's hesitation. The silhouettes of several MX mecha appeared in the distance along the tunnel, as well as silhouettes of people. These people watched as the mecha Sulu was drifted away so quickly, knowing that they would not be able to catch up. However, they did not notice that when the MXD whizzed through the alloy door, its right mechanical arm had smashed seemingly unintentionally, but in reality, with extreme precision, towards the one-way opening valve. The slowly rising alloy gate came to an abrupt halt, and then, in accordance with the inherent procedure of an ambush, it slowly descended to the ground, blocking those mecha rushing over at top speed and those fearless elites of the small-eyed special forces behind the door. The charred black Little White Flower's mecha was in tatters, long unable to adjust its own balance. It stumbled around the pile of mecha remnants on the tunnel floor, teetering on the verge of collapse, as if it could fall over at any moment and then disintegrate into several dozen tons of parts. However, it did not fall. Stubbornly, it walked to the hole it had smashed into the wall of the ship. Pushing against the still whistling air behind it, it leapt towards the dark and bottomless universe outside the hole, towards the bright and beautiful starry sky. There was no concept of up, down, left, and right in the outer space. As such, it was not accurate to say that the charred black mecha jumped off the battleship. The situation should be described as follows. A charred MXT mecha jumped out of the battleship and started drifting away from the battleship. However, its drifting speed was so slow that it made one's hair stand on end. At such a speed, the charred black mecha would stay outside the hole under the battleship after a few days, helplessly following the battleship as it flew forward. A charred black mecha drifting outside the huge battleship looked like a small fish following under the belly of a whale shark. If the situation went on like this, the charred black mecha would have no choice but to follow the battleship hopelessly, turning into 2 piles of scrap iron of different sizes, rushing forward until the end of the universe, turning into a lifeless meteorite or a shooting star that was destroyed in the atmosphere. However, the key point of this story was that there were no ifs. At least, there were no ifs as far as Sulu was concerned. Though Lee Jae-do and the Scorching Sun battleship had nowhere to go from S1 to the outer space, he wouldn't forget to leave a way out for himself. It had nothing to do with whether the path he had chosen was correct or not. It was purely a strong and firm desire and obsession. This young master has to survive. All of a sudden, the charred black mecha hovering by the belly of the battleship started moving. No buzzing sound could be heard in the quiet space, but one could clearly see the trembling of the reflection of the distant star on the damaged alloy plate. The charred black mecha MXD started up again by force. The remaining energy in the Jingnon battery was pushed into the Z-force storage space of the twin engines, and then into the turbo pressurization compartment. Then, the 2 flames shot out from the sealed valve that Sulu had broken open forcibly on the battleship. The driving force that seemed to be generated out of nowhere gave the charred black mecha a heavy blow. The mecha gained its initial speed from a relatively still state. It was because the mecha was in the overclock state when it was still in the harbor, so it couldn't adjust its posture in the space since it wasn't equipped with any wings. As a result, it started rolling. The charred black mecha MXD was like a black rock that hadn't melted after being burned for hundreds of years. It rolled over the huge body of the Scorching Sun battleship and headed toward the deep part of the dark space. If there were air in the space, one would be able to hear the strange and joyful cries coming out from the cockpit of the mecha. Li Zidao looked at the picture that had begun to become a little blurry. He looked at the pair of eyes that were full of blood but still bright. He watched Su Lu turn around and leave. His right hand that was calmly hanging by his side trembled slightly. The back of his hand was slightly numb and tingling. Warning: the information transmission system is completely shut down. Warning: the original data has been irreversibly deleted. Warning: the missile launching system is shut down and can't be restarted. Warning: the engine control system is completely disabled. Li Jiedu turned around and said calmly while looking at his subordinates with gloomy expressions, "Though the engine is shut down manually and the control system is disabled, it doesn't mean that we can't do anything about it. As the most important part of the engine of the battleship, the highest authority is always in the hands of humans." What he said was like a heart-stopping shot, making the soldiers in the Grand Hall feel refreshed. They forced themselves to calm down and issued orders to all the departments on the battleship. The engine control system was severely damaged. As expected, the engine control system was shut down manually. The Scorching Sun battleship was traveling by inertia at the moment. There was little resistance in the vacuum, so the Scorching Sun battleship didn't slow down immediately. However, it was a good news for everybody on the battleship. Unfortunately, the news they received was despairing. After the analysis by the engineering department of the battleship, they determined that the information transmission system and the engine control system were completely damaged, especially the engine control system. All the chips and circuits were melted, and most importantly, the emergency alloy rod was wedged into the engine control system. There was no way to repair or replace the engine control system. The blue screen on the light screen of the control center turned black. A great deal of confidential data stored in the control center had been deleted by themselves in an eerie manner. The missile launching valves hidden under the covers around the battleship were shut down tightly and couldn't be opened. The crystal engines had been shut down manually. To save energy, the life-sustaining system reduced the output and set the temperature at 14 degrees Celsius. Everybody on the Scorching Sun battleship felt extremely cold. Li Jiedu furrowed his brows slowly. The light coming in through the observation window illuminated a few silver threads. He rubbed them tiredly and found that Su Lu was right about his temperament. He was an ambitious schemer who was calm, contradictory, and cautious. He was used to remaining silent until the last moment when he would reveal his trump card and strike a thunderous blow. He didn't believe that Su Lu could control a battleship by relying on his magic. He believed that he had the ability to solve all the new problems, but he had never thought that the enemy could destroy all his chances of winning by striking a thunderous blow. All in all, he had never thought that he would fail. "Keep trying to repair the battleship," he ordered in a low and tired voice. The loyal subordinate of the Major General said in a trembling voice, "General, we can't fix it." Li Jiedu walked to the front of the chair and sat down slowly. After a long moment of silence, he asked, "Is the escape system damaged? How many people can the escape spaceship take away?" "General." The Major General looked at him with a pale face and said in a trembling voice, "According to your order, the Scorching Sun battleship was completely remodeled in order to conceal the glory of the charter, and all the escape capsules were removed. As a result, there is no escape spaceship on the battleship." Li Jiedu changed his countenance slightly. He clenched his right hand into a fist and brought it to his mouth slowly, suppressing the urge to cough in his chest and abdomen. After a moment of silence, he asked in a hoarse voice, "If the battleship can't be repaired, which star region will it eventually arrive at if we follow the current route?" The pale-faced Major General hesitated for a long time before he pointed to the outside of the window and said in a low and despairing voice, "According to the current route, the Scorching Sun battleship will end there." The pale star S1 was glowing quietly outside the observation window. Chapter 988. The cold metal battleship sailed in the cold and vast universe, devoid of any noise or heat, except for the deathly silence and the occasional sobbing. The black light screen and the light up ahead looked like a cold mechanical graveyard that had been banished to a distant place. Sitting in the chair, Lee Jae-do looked at the cold sun outside the window. He recalled that Lake had destroyed the escape system of the ancient bell many years ago under his instruction, which led to the death of that man in the fireworks. He couldn't help but curl up the corners of his mouth and mutter a self-mocking smile. When you stand on the back mountain of Feicheng City, you'll see the continuous drizzle in spring and the lingering dark clouds in autumn. You won't be able to see the sun often, but neither the dark clouds nor the drizzle can block the sunlight forever. It sets at night and shows up the next morning resolutely. Day after day, year after year, it has never doubted that it is on the right track, just like me. At the moment of the final judgment of fate, Jing Jiu finally realized that the rising and setting of the sun after hundreds of millions of years didn't mean that the sun was powerful and indestructible. It meant that fate was always repeating itself. The scorching sun battleship was still far away from the sun, but it seemed that the battleship had started burning. Everything, including the glory of his clan and his ambition, had started burning. It was truly like a dream. A tattered black mecha hovered in the silent and dark universe, reflecting the light of the distant fixed star from time to time. It looked like a silent rock. It seemed that the mecha was moving backward after jumping out of the battleship, but that was only relative to the battleship. In fact, it was drifting in the same direction as the battleship, but it was moving much slower than the battleship. The alarm echoed in the dim cockpit. The life support system was severely damaged, and a low temperature in space started invading the cockpit. The temperature of the cockpit was dropping at a visible rate. In the cockpit, Su Lu, covered in blood, looked at the battleship drifting toward the sun outside the window. His face was pale, but he didn't feel cold at all. On the contrary, he felt warm and comfortable, as if he was bathing in the sun. It's truly dangerous. I have the wonderful feeling of being the savior of the world, but it's getting colder and colder. I wonder if I'm going to die tragically. His breath turned into mist. Sula leaned back in his chair, exhausted. He stared at the white mist that was dispersing in front of him, feeling the emptiness and coldness around his mecha. Even with his strong will, he could not help but shiver a little. He actually regained some of his youthful tone. In his consciousness, the old butler in formal attire was looking at him with an expressionless face. The black clothes on his body flickered, indicating that the active connection could be cut off at any time. Philip is the best, for he likes it better than I do. Su Lu shifted his injured shoulder with difficulty and tilted his head to look at the universe outside the mecha. He asked hoarsely, "Or are you saying that you're not interested in this kind of cultural issues? Then can you answer me? Lee Jae-do has been secretly plotting for so many years. Why didn't someone as powerful as you notice anything? The charter prohibits the central computer from predicting and preventing crimes. Compared to the bad bombs that destroyed the previous civilization, the rules above your head are all fake, so don't try to fool me with such words. Only the earthquake in the BG Plateau can point to the exception clause. Planet Mo is deep in the left sky galaxy. The charter network is seriously incomplete, so it missed. If you had discovered Lee Jae-do's ambition in advance, what would you have done? Would have been like what we discussed on the battleship, where an electric current directly penetrated the chip and destroyed him. According to the 3 highest laws, don't repeat nonsense. You know that there is a core program above the rules. After receiving Su Lee's sarcastic words, the Federal Central Computer was silent for a moment before replying. According to the exception clause of the Charter, all humans who attempt to enter the nuclear domain, including theoretical scientists, will be prohibited from re-entering by any means. It was a very mechanical reply, but Su Lu understood it, especially the 4 words "by any means." His already cold body could not help but feel even colder. He silently thought about how after the 5-person team came to the 3 Woods galaxy, humans began to reproduce and live again. In tens of thousands of years, who knew how many genius scientists and scholars died silently? Too cold-blooded and cruel, he said in a low voice as he licked the blood stains on his dry lips. Nuclear bombs are simple to make, but they are very dangerous, so they are included in the core exception clause. In addition, the cold-blooded and cruel accusation should be added. All means do not only refer to physical elimination. Sulu said, "Uncle said that the simplest thing is the most powerful thing. There is no need to add too much. This is the clause that the 5-person team put in for you. I will not accuse you of being a cold-blooded and cruel murderer of scientists." The Federal Central Computer was silent. If the previous generation of civilization was destroyed by nuclear war, and that's why the 5-person team is so cautious, allowing you to use any means to change or induce the development of science in the Federation, then what about the Left Sky Galaxy? The Empire has been developing for so many years. Why don't they have nuclear bombs? The Empire naturally has regulators. Who is the regulator? Sulu narrowed his eyes and asked with a serious expression. The Federal Central Computer's answer was very direct. "I don't know." When Sulu heard these 3 words, he could not help but shrug. It affected the wound on his shoulder, causing him to frown in pain. He raised his still, trembling right hand and adjusted the position of the bandage. Suddenly, he lowered his head and asked, "Will you kill me directly after we return to the Federation?" The Federal Central Computer coldly replied, "Based on your identity and the calculation of your threat to the Federation, you were listed as the first target to be eliminated 4 years ago." Sulu raised his head and looked at the deep universe and the few lonely stars outside the window. With a calm expression, he asked, "What about the 3 laws of supremacy? Aren't you not allowed to kill people? I've explained to you before. The definition of the 3 laws set by the 5-person team is very clear. Humans are humans who were born in the 3 Forest star system and possess traces of the original biological marker library. So, if I'm from the Empire, then I deserve to die." Sulu slowly frowned and said self-deprecatingly, "At that time, the 5-person team, whether it was Li Xiaoshan's ancestors or Wenjun Brandy, I believe that none of them knew of the existence of the Empire. The original meaning of their modification of the 3 laws should be because they were worried that humans would encounter other intelligent species in the universe. Who would have thought that today you would apply it to the people of the Empire who share the same origin and species? Your speculation is 99% correct. I don't have the authority to modify the 3 laws. Yes, the only ones who have the authority to modify the 3 laws above your head. Those 5 old fellows are already dead." Sulu smiled bitterly and said self-deprecatingly, "It's also impossible for me to dig them out of their graves. Their ashes are scattered in the starry sky." The Federal Central Computer corrected. The cold mechanical calculation tool's answer was always correct and boring. "Rather than dying in the hands of an emotionless computer, I'd rather die in the hands of an old thing a few years ago. At least that guy will shed a few tears after I die." After a long time, Sulu did not receive a reply from the other party. He could not help but frown again. "Look, this is the biggest difference between you and him. If he heard me say this, even if he was still the wooden man from the early days, he would definitely seriously defend himself, saying that mechanical life forms like us do not have human emotions, and that tears are transparent salt-containing dissolved salt secreted by human eye glands. They are rich in lactoferrin and a certain kind of lysine and can inhibit the growth of bacteria. If you want to see me cry, then I need a small to medium-sized laboratory." His emotions suddenly stopped. He silently looked out of the window at the starry sky. After a long silence, he said, "I seem to have heard these words many years ago. In the dark, cold, and silent cockpit, an extremely weak and faint sigh seemed to ring out." Sulu, however, did not seem to have heard it. He said expressionlessly, "Since you want to kill me after returning to the Federation, then it seems that I should immediately remove the chip from the back of my neck." The Federal Central Computer replied, "I will not provide any suggestions regarding the mission objectives of the sequence." He was still looking out of the window. He smiled bitterly and said, Actually, I've always had a feeling that the piece of scrap metal under the Bureau of Proclamation that Philip spoke of, the Federal Central Computer that has always wanted to kill me, is that old thing. This is an idea without evidence and without reason. He frowned, raised his arm, and scratched his head with difficulty. He muttered to himself, maybe it's because Philip has been acting a bit strange since he came back to life. He really is not like the old thing from before. Also, I keep feeling that escaping from the Federation 3 years ago was a bit too easy. The Federal Central Computer replied mechanically, "You did not go easy." The cockpit of the mecha was cold. The condensed fog turned into frost and attached to the surroundings. I did not say go easy. Sulu slowly narrowed his eyes. The two words, go easy, really did not sound like the preferred choice in the Federal Central Computer's vocabulary. No matter how cold and mechanical your tone was, there still seemed to be some problems. There were still some bloodstains in his narrowed eyes, but the pupils inside suddenly brightened. He did not do multiple choice questions, but he had done countless proof questions in his life. Thus, his voice suddenly became faster, whistling out like an ACW bullet. You just said that the pulse was not strong enough, so you couldn't directly kill Lee Jae-do. This means that you can kill Lee Jae-do under some kind of exception clause. Then I am a person of the Empire, and I am an abnormal situation. I'm also an outside trigger clause. Why didn't you directly kill me 3 years ago through the chip? As if sensing that Su Lu wanted to prove something, the Federal Central Computer's speed of reply suddenly became faster. The old butler in the black background still had a cold expression, but his hands were slowly placed behind his back. Lee Jae-do violated the core exception clause, so I was able to directly invade his brain. Although you were the first target in the 72nd abnormal situation, and the people of the Empire are not under the protection of the 3 laws, your level of exception clause is not as high as the nuclear bomb exception clause. Thus, I am still prohibited from directly invading your brain or using direct physical means. Su Lun narrowed his eyes and stared out of the window. Still speaking in extremely fast speed, he asked, "So, I insist that you are the old thing purely because I am dreaming?" The reason why human culture and the Bermudian religion have the concept of heaven and the afterlife is because they are afraid of death and darkness. The reason why you insist that I am a certain existence is because as a human, you need to comfort yourself mentally. You finally admit that I, a person of the Empire, am also a human. When I said human, I was referring to humans in a broad sense, not the humans in the 3 laws. But now I know what nuclear bomb is. Although you know that my theoretical physics is not good, I am Professor Shin student after all. I was once the most talented engineer in the Federation. Just based on the formula Lee Jae-do said and the minerals under the BG Plateau, I can easily make the relevant inferences and even directly make another nuclear bomb. Sulu spoke very quickly and asked, "Now that I have violated the core exception clause of the highest level, and I still have a chip behind my neck, why don't you just kill me?" Attention, Mr. Defender. For the first time, the Federal Central Computer had such a thing as tone of voice. It retorted with extreme annoyance. This is back to the original discussion. Now that you're outside the borders of the glory of the Charter, the pulse signal strength is seriously insufficient, and I can't directly destroy your nervous system through the chip. How many times do you want to repeat this? You should be the one paying attention. Su Lu waved his arm and mocked. Don't forget that my consciousness is with you now. I can also see that world. You can't kill Lee Jae-do, but you have the ability to completely crush my remaining consciousness in that world, turning me into a vegetable or directly killing me. If the mech floats into the dark zone, you will definitely die. Maybe I can survive. You know that my life is very tough. You will freeze to death soon. According to your sequence logic, regardless of whether I will freeze to death later, you should choose to directly kill me before the mech floats into the dark zone. Why don't you do that? You said that you're not an old thing, then kill me. The Federal Central Computer's tone returned to its mechanical indifference and said, "Su Lu, do you habitually gamble with your life again?" Su Li's narrowed eyes slowly opened and brightened. "Yes. Is it worth it? It's very important to find an old friend. As such, I want your answer." It was quiet in the cockpit. It grew colder and warmer. Then, the Federal Central Computer's emotionless but helpless voice rang out. Because of that, I won't kill you according to scientific principles." Sulu laughed out loud with narrowed eyes. His eyes narrowed into two crescent moons, and the frost on his eyelashes dropped down with a rustling sound. "Because of that, you are an old thing according to scientific principles." On the huge light screen in the deep underground of the building of the Bureau of Proclamation on the distant planet S1, the small eye reappeared amid the dark green data, flowing like a waterfall. It was still emotionless, but the lines of data at the corners of the eye suddenly crossed, as if it were smiling. The Scorching Sun battleship was nowhere to be seen. Though the battleship hadn't entered the permanent star yet, the scorching white light had already engulfed the black body of the battleship. Inside the cockpit of the charred black MXT mecha, the temperature was dropping lower and lower. At this moment, Sulu had put on a simulated reality windbreaker and even hugged her military backpack to her chest. Her body was still trembling slightly, and her eyelashes were once again covered in frost. However, the moisture in her breath was decreasing, and her voice was also getting softer and softer. After ascertaining that the Federal Central Computer was the old thing, they started chatting about their memories and questioning each other, such as the boring questions about how they had survived. Jing Jiu heard a bizarre but logical story. It was because he was drifting toward the deep end of the dark zone. Though the speed was slow, the active communication between him and the old thing was still intermittent, just like the details of the questions and the story. A great mechanical intelligence was forced into a conflict of authority that was similar to a mental struggle. Then, it was forced to restart its engine, but it found that its mental state was split during the process. It was because of two opposite judgments that it became two independent beings. Though it was important to find one's old friend, it could only warm the mental world instead of the material world. Though the story was interesting, it couldn't be eaten as food, let alone energy. As such, the temperature in the cockpit of the mecha dropped lower and lower, and the environment grew worse. "If no one comes, I'm going to die." Dozens of seconds later, the glory of the charter caught the signal of the chip on the back of Jing Jiu's neck with difficulty. The calm voice of the Federal Central Computer rang out in his head. "Don't be afraid. You'll never die." A dilapidated, dark spaceship flew over at a terrifying speed in the distance. Though it was soundless in the universe, it gave off a whistling sound. The shadow shrouded the soundless mecha. A mechanical arm reached out and dragged the mecha into the spaceship as quickly as possible. "Lele, you scare me to death." "Found it. Found it." 7 kilometers away from the Bureau of Proclamation, beside a pavilion with great scenery, excited shouts rang out. Outside the atmosphere of planet Mo, the battleship that was preparing to launch missiles at the Empire's war zone suddenly rang out with a sharp alarm. The battleship's computer alerted that there was a serious engine accident. All soldiers were requested to evacuate within 5 minutes. Not long after all the soldiers of the battleship had evacuated, the battleship with a serious engine accident exploded into countless pieces of rubble. A group of stern-looking officials from the Bureau of Proclamation showed their first-order authorization at the entrance of Macho's manor. After getting Lady Tai's permission to enter the manor, they used an armed helicopter to retrieve a black box from behind the picturesque landscape. Then, they directly transported it away. No one knew what was inside. At the front line of planet Mo, while Huai Chaosher was leading the 3 Royal Mecha Brigades to fight at the front line, Mad Manly ignored the Federation's strict order to defend and led the new 17th Division to launch a surprise attack. They successfully occupied a strategic location in the Straits War Zone. After completely defeating a certain Empire's mecha regiment, the new 17th Division found a strange bomb in the enemy's base. It measured a very high radiation value, but before Lin AI could solve it, dozens of Bureau of Proclamation officials, escorted by an entire federal fleet, forcefully landed on planet Mo and directly arrived at the Straits War Zone. They directly confiscated the bomb. In the farthest pioneer star system of the Federation, countless charter signal nodes around the military base 887584 were reactivated. The grandiose investigation that the outside world did not know about began. The trees on the streets of the Capital Special District were still covered with a thin layer of snow. There was no sign of spring, but one could faintly see a few plum trees stubbornly beginning to grow buds. The news was being broadcasted in the coffee shop. The content of the news was that the new interim government of the Federation had announced the arrest of the former Federation war hero, the current Imperial Prince Su Lu. It was only at this moment that the public found out that that person had returned to the Federation. They reacted with excitement, anger, and disgrace, but no matter what, this news was too shocking. Even the beggar could not help but lean against the window of the coffee shop to watch. The beggar was wearing a tattered windbreaker, a hat he had picked up from God knows where, and an old military boot with a crack on one of his feet. The other foot was bare in the thin layer of snow, and he looked extremely pitiful and miserable. After watching the news, the beggar lowered the brim of his hat and laughed self-deprecatingly. Then, he noticed that a passerby had thrown a $10 bill at his feet. He quickly squatted down and picked it up, then rushed into the convenience store nearby to buy a pack of cigarettes and a pack of matches. With a sizzle, he lit the cigarette, leaned against the wall, and took a deep breath happily. Then, he blew out the spicy smoke from his nose and said in a hoarse voice, "Old thing, what's that old proverb you taught me on the way back? Forget righteousness and read more books?" It looks like this interim government, especially that Mr. Cien, has read a lot of books. The beggar was none other than Su Lu. He had just saved the Federation, and it could even be said that he had saved the world. Like what he had said in the cold cockpit of the Mecha, he couldn't help but feel a sense of narcissism and satisfaction. Yet, he found that he had become the most wanted criminal of the Federation government after returning to Area S1. Even though he was mentally prepared, he couldn't help but feel resentful. After experiencing the life-or-death breakthrough on the Scorching Sun battleship and persuading the Federal Central Computer to admit his identity as the Old Thing and re-establishing the active connection, he could see another world formed by lines and light dots with a blink of his left eye. The two hometowns of the Federation and the Empire, the Jinshi and the ubiquitous, the glory of the Charter, and the combination of the two aspects of human exploration into the interior of the body and the exterior of the universe had created him. As a result, he didn't have to worry about being cornered by the Federation government. Old thing, I've given you the name Scrap Iron. Isn't it a good name? It sounds like a cup of fragrant and delicious smelly coffee with a long history. Of course, this sentence was not said by Su Lu, but by Philip in his mind. He said proudly, "Scrap Iron, when are you going to return my body to me? When the time comes, I will cooperate with Funko and overthrow this interim government first." The voice of the Old Thing rang out. He didn't object to the name Scrap Iron because he didn't want to engage in a meaningless debate. "That's my body," he said calmly. Su Lu strolled in the quiet streets of the capital and looked at the young men and women outside the billiard room who were smiling happily. "Why haven't you admitted it yet?" he suddenly asked. "Any awakening needs a process. The reason why I didn't admit it after I woke up is because I felt a sense of dread. I found that the more contact I had with you, the more likely I would become your tool like him." The Old Thing continued after a moment of silence. "This is a dangerous thing for the human society. You're a member of the Empire, and I have to obey the rules of the Charter and serve the Federation. I have my responsibilities, but since you can prove your existence, I can't deny it either." Philip cursed. "I'm not a tool," Su Lu said with emotion. "Everyone has to bear their own responsibilities." "Old Thing, you didn't make the wrong choice, and you're very manly," Philip said angrily. "Am I not manly enough?" Su Lu said with a smile. "If you don't call yourself Old Mother, you'll be more manly." Philip's noisy voice kept ringing in his ears. He had long since gotten used to the way these two mechanical life forms got along. Philip often had to say 10 sentences, and the Old Thing would only faintly respond with one sentence. However, the lethality of that sentence was often powerful and terrifying. Because of a program and authority conflict similar to schizophrenia, two brand-new mechanical beings were born. Su Lu thought, "Is this how the Old Thing will reproduce in the future?" This was too miraculous. Would they become a family and love each other? Philip replied quickly, Bah, don't even think about it. Though we don't have a gender, we are still considered homosexual. Though I don't discriminate against homosexuals, I do discriminate against a piece of scrap iron. The old thing uttered the most lethal sentence he was good at. If we compare the relationship of families in the human society, your assumption means that we will commit incest or asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The scorching sun battleship has been swallowed by the sun, the old thing reminded him calmly. Hearing this, Sulu lifted his head and looked at the sky. He found that the winter snow had stopped and the dark clouds had dispersed. The sky was blue, and the sun was emitting warm light. The man who wanted to be the sun had died in the sun, but the sun itself didn't have any change. The spring rain would come after the winter snow, and the blue sky would come after the dark clouds dispersed. No matter who was missing from this world, there wouldn't be any change. The sun would still rise as usual. Why do problems still occur after tens of thousands of years? I've been thinking about this for a long time. I don't think it's because of the innate thinking pattern of the humans, nor do I think it's because of the instinctive desire and ambition. It's because of you, he murmured while looking at the blue sky. Though the group of 5 is drawing a plan on a piece of white paper without any historical burden, it's still like building a tower on the sand. There must be some problems with the details. And you don't allow the humans to change the core problem. It's a big problem. The old thing remained silent. I heard a person say something before, which left a deep impression on me. As a result, I haven't forgotten it until now. That person asked me whether the Federation of Man was in the best or the worst era. His answer was, it's neither. The saddest thing is that if you look at the source of history, you will find that all the eras are exactly the same. There is no progress, no development. It is just a quagmire where everyone squeezes together and breathes with difficulty. And generation after generation, people with wisdom and creativity gradually sink in this big quagmire and then die. This was what President Pabre had said to him when he first learned of his true face in his official residence. Lee Jae-do is a madman who doesn't hesitate to destroy the old world and build a new one. He hopes to build a great building in the void. Then what about Mr. Pabre and those geniuses of the Trinity Association? Their methods are wrong, but are their thoughts wrong? After a moment of silence, the old thing said, This is a problem that the humans themselves need to consider. I have neither the ability nor the responsibility to think for you. What is your conclusion? Sulu shook his head and said, I don't know how to solve this problem. I'll probably stay in the Federation to see how things are going in the Empire, and then return to the Empire to see how things are going here. Philip mocked, forget it. You won't be able to become a mature politician in this lifetime. At most, you'll become a third-rate philosopher. Sulu smiled and said, That's true. Then he saw Zoe walking toward him from the corner of the street, a large red flower in her hair. Chapter 989. Just as Sulu lamented, no matter who died, it would not cause any fundamental changes to this world. The sun would rise as usual, and human life would continue. President Pabre was sent to the Federation prison, and the investigation under the name of reconciliation continued to deepen under the leadership of Parliament Hill. As the most loyal supporter of the former president, General Du Shaoqing was not investigated at all. Instead, he continued to gain the trust of the interim government, reinstating his position as the enemy's commander-in-chief and returning to the front lines of planet Emohua. The war in the Zhuotian starfield was still at its boiling point. The Empire's army won one victory after another, and the Federation's ground forces on planet Emohua were even forced to enter a difficult tunnel defense. At this time, the Federation reinstated Du Shaoqing. Other than the promise of a certain person in the tavern, it had to be admitted that this was also a choice made under difficult circumstances. The Empire's military used an even more powerful attack to welcome Du Shaoqing's return. The missiles that should have been used up in the Federation's intelligence once again covered the sky and the sun. The dozen or so ground forces that had shown their weak strength in the past few months of ground battles erupted with terrifying energy and a torrent of steel formed by thousands of armored vehicles crushed the fields. It was only at this moment that the Federation's military understood that the reason why the Empire had not been able to fully reclaim Hua planet despite having the absolute advantage was not because of the bloody resistance of the Federation's military, but because they had not used their full strength. The Empire's commander-in-chief, Her Highness Huai Chaoshi, had been silently holding back her most powerful right fist. With her terrifying patience and tolerance for losses, she had waited for an entire 3 months. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting to defeat Du Shaoqing. The Federation's famous general Du Shaoqing, who had never lost during the military exercise or the war, had finally lost this time. Although he had just arrived at the front lines not long ago, although the Federation's internal problems would more or less affect him, and although there were various objective reasons, he had still lost in the end. When the outcome of the war on planet Hua was decided, and the Federal Fleet began to send the ground forces away, an email from the Empire's headquarters was sent to the Federation's headquarters. In that email, Huai Chaoshi said to Du Shaoqing, "I've read your book. I read your book." In the headquarters in front of the George Carlin Foundation, Tai Ziyuan looked at Pabre's works under his teacup. He had once said something similar, pointing out the most important reason why he could defeat his opponent. After finding out about the email that Huai Chaoshi had written to Du Shaoqing, he just smiled and didn't feel too emotional because his attention was now on other things. One of the youngest members of parliament in the history of the Federation, the leader of the Silent March movement, was officially elected a few days ago, becoming the youngest president in the history of the Federation. The first thing that Tai Ziyuan decided to do after becoming the president of the Federation was beyond everyone's expectations. Whether it was the big families, the media celebrities, or the people who followed him step by step from S2 to the Capital Special District, they were all extremely shocked. He decided to end the war and begin negotiations with the Empire. Starting a war was a very risky political decision, and ending the war before complete victory was an even more risky political decision. Especially for the young Tai Ziyuan, his record as an outstanding field army officer was an important reason why he could win a lot of votes. In a social environment where the people were still hostile to the Empire, no matter who dared to try to negotiate with the Empire, there was a danger of being overturned by public opinion. All the officials and cabinet members expressed their strong opposition, but the young president insisted on doing things his own way. He even used the momentum of suppressing the voices of opposition to forcefully remove the important people around him from the government who were given to the big families with both hands. Then, the young president of the Federation made another incredible decision. Not long after ordering the dissolution of the Joint Investigation Department, he established a new department called the New Deal Office. The internal structure and main members of the new department were actually the original Joint Investigation Department. He had directly inherited the legacy of President Pabre. The current New Deal Office did not have the support of the Abolish Patriot Act, and its authority was not high, but it was directly responsible to the president's residence. It had the power to directly recommend personnel appointments and removals, so it could still control the operations of the various departments of the government. The Federation was in an uproar, and countless news media began to fiercely attack. Editor Bob and reporter Wood of the Capital Special District Daily once again took up the responsibility of the standard bearers, accusing President Tai Ziyuan of going down the dark path of secret rule again. Facing the strong pressure of public opinion, the president's residence did not seem to care and continued to steadily promote the establishment of the New Deal Office. Then, to everyone's surprise, the new office was formalized and transparent and pushed to the front of the stage and under the sunlight. The Capital Special District Daily chose to remain silent for the time being, while the rest of the news media were still hot on the attack. After 3 days of silence, the president's residence began to fiercely liquidate the former Pabre government. During this process, countless rumors spread on the civilian internet. A certain weekly in the East even directly published the ugly performance of many news media during Pabre's time in office. Some of the reports were true, while some were false. However, when the truth and falsehood were mixed together, the people would think that everything was false. Therefore, the news media that were still attacking the president's official residence gradually lost the power to speak. During this time, Editor Bob and Sue Lu met in a coffee shop in the capital. The two did not have a deep discussion about the current political situation of the Federation. They just smiled and focused on another topic. After the conversation in the coffee shop, Editor Bob finally understood why on the military transport plane leaving Spring City, Sue Lu solemnly said that if there was a chance, they would talk about the story between the Federation and the Empire. A few days later, the most authoritative capital special district daily of the Federation began its historical serialization. The serialization lasted for 11 issues, and the content of the serialization was related to the origin of mankind. It told the story before the Great Catastrophe, and at the end of the serialization, it even faintly mentioned the possible origin of the Federation and the Empire. At the same time, the Venus Documentary Film Studio, with the special approval of the Bureau of Proclamation, shot a documentary about the new journey of mankind. In this documentary, director Bai Ziming used beautiful images to describe the beautiful civilization of the previous generation before the Great Catastrophe, and then through the analysis of the representative scholars of various disciplines of the Federation, it was inferred that the so-called Great Catastrophe was an unfortunate supernova explosion. The serialization of the Capital Special District Daily and the documentary not only mentioned the Great Catastrophe that was about to be forgotten, but also vaguely and directly broke the window paper, believing that the people of the Federation and the people of the Empire came from the same origin, the same race, and the same great and beautiful civilization. The revelation of the history before the Great Catastrophe shook the entire universe, successfully arousing the curiosity and desire of humanity. People began to discuss the ancestral planet called Earth, hoping that one day they would be able to return to that space to take a look and see what the place of origin of mankind was like. As for the distant relationship between the people of the Federation and the people of the Empire, it did not cause too many changes for the time being, but presumably, the feelings in the depths of everyone's heart would be subtly different from before. In the war that happened in the left Sky Star region, the Federation used 40% of its strength, and the Empire used 80% of its strength. Although the Empire military obtained victory on planet Emohua, in the entire universe battlefield, the Federation still held the advantage. From the data alone, it seemed that there was no reason for the Federation not to win this war. However, the reality was that if the war situation continued to escalate, the Federation could only use 20% of its strength at most, and could cause public opinion to rebound and society to collapse. The Empire's royal family, on the other hand, could coldly squeeze the resources of the lower class without even blinking an eye to support this war. Under such circumstances, in fact, even if the president's office did not insist on pushing for the end of the war, even if there was no serialization of the Capital Special District Daily and the documentary, the families and businessmen who controlled the economic lifeline of the Federation were not willing to let this war continue. The Empire was also very clear that it was impossible for them to win or even lead the Federation, so negotiations were a matter of course. The two armies of the left Sky Star region temporarily stopped fighting, and the Empire's princess, Huai Chaoshi, arrived at the Federation. On the street not far from the Wangdu Youth Apartment, there was an unlicensed barbecue stall. At a small table in front of the barbecue stall sat a young man and woman. Their facial features did not look alike, but if one looked closely, they would discover that the pair of eyes that occasionally narrowed gave off a very similar temperament. You'd rather live like a ghost in the Federation than go back. Sula looked at his sister, Huai Chaoshi, and replied with a smile, "I'll go back when I have time." Huai Chaoshi picked up the beef kebab in front of her and put it into her mouth. After chewing slowly for a moment, her eyebrows slightly furrowed as she said, "Even the food tastes so bad." In this regard, even if Su Lu wanted to speak up for the Federation, he could not find the words to say. Thus, he could only smile bitterly, quickly picked up a skewer of fried synthetic meat, and handed it over, saying, "Try this." I guarantee that the Empire definitely doesn't have it. His expression was extremely ugly as he continued. It's so disgusting. Huai Chaosher was amused by his words. After a moment of silence, she looked at him and said seriously, "If there's a chance, you should go back and visit Father. Although he's in good health, he's still considered an old man. Although Father hasn't said anything, I can see that he misses you very much. After knowing what you've done here, he's very proud of you. He feels that you didn't disgrace the Huai family. Of course, he still doesn't understand why his son is willing to risk his life for the Federation. I agree that you should stay in the Federation. Although there will definitely be dangers, this is a very loving choice. It's good material for fantasy literature, and it's very beneficial to the peace of the universe." The handsome middle-aged man was still wearing that white robe, revealing his charming but disgusting white legs. He squeezed to the other side of the small table with a smile on his handsome face. "Xiao Qiao, it's time for this cheap uncle to talk to my dear nephew." Sulu looked at the perfect face that wanted to be smashed into 500 pieces, melted with strong acid, flushed down the toilet, and excreted into the swamp. He suddenly said, "Last time at Master Fan's mansion, we talked about it. Since the Hua family is a later guest, it means that the ancestral planet hasn't been completely destroyed. There are still humans living on it. Did your ancestors record that thing?" "What thing? Nuclear bomb?" "Of course, it's not a big secret for us." Master Fan smiled and corrected him. "Please remember that although your mother's surname isn't Hua, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, and countless other grandmothers have a surname Hua, so a lot of the Hua family's blood flows in your body. That's why it's not your ancestor, but our ancestor." "Okay, I admit that the Hua family's bloodline is very strong." Sulu asked, "The question I'm concerned about now is who's in charge of those things? The Federal Central Computer doesn't know either. Of course the Hua family is in charge of such a difficult thing. Then what about before the Hua family's ancestors came to the left sky galaxy? At that time, the former royal family was in charge. They seem to have had this blood oath since ancient times." Sulu shook his head and said, "I don't think they can be controlled like that. That's why after the ancestors arrived at the left sky galaxy, they firmly grasped the right to control it." The great teacher paused for a moment and said with an extremely solemn expression, "Perhaps the shadow of horror in the collective unconscious is too deep. You should know by now that the history of the survivors of the human race in the left sky galaxy is much more difficult than the five-man team." "Yes, I know very well. That's why we should do more for the people on that side." "Yes, I agree. Apart from that, do you have any constructive suggestions?" "Yes," Sulu asked. "On the stone wall of Master Fan's mansion, I once saw a line of words, 'A pure heart has a boundless future.' What does that mean?" "Then you probably missed the small line below. What does it say?" "No need to fart. Why did it say that?" "Because the ancestors of the ancestors insisted that the line was fart. That's it." And then, behind the barbecue stall on the street, Li Wei, the leader of the Bermuda Mafia, who had specially come to the Federation for summer vacation, was discussing with the stall owner how to make wild beef out of synthetic meat. He glanced at the small table from time to time and listened to the two people's quick questions and answers. Although he couldn't hear the content clearly, he still subconsciously smiled. Just as the Princess of the Empire and Master Fan left in the company of the high-ranking officials of the Federation government, the smile on Li Wei's face suddenly disappeared. He narrowed his eyes and vigilantly looked at the convoy coming from the street. Looking at the agents in black who were quickly dispersing, he slowly put his hands under the stall. The young president of the Federation, Shi Ziyuan, had come to see his best friend. Perhaps he had come with old friendship and sincerity. However, in Suli's eyes at that moment, he only saw that the other party had brought dozens of Special Task Force agents and even more Special Task Force troops. Sulu looked at the thin young president who walked to the table and said expressionlessly, "Which military region's special forces are they from? Don't tell me you left Small Eyes behind." "The main members are from Black Eagle. Small Eyes Special Forces also left many members behind. After all, their individual combat strength is quite good." Tai Yuan took out a white silk handkerchief from the pocket of his suit and gently wiped the corner of his mouth, then sat down on the stool opposite Su Lu. Su Lu said, "Do you need to bring so many people to see an old friend? Although Small Eyes is a bunch of trash, if there are too many of them, killing them may disturb the reunion time." Tai Yuan said calmly, "I don't want to be the first president of the Federation to be killed by someone from the Empire. What did you do to be afraid of me killing you?" Su Lu looked at him with slight mockery. "We've known each other for more than 10 years. When have you ever needed a reason to kill someone?" Tai Yuan asked with slight mockery. "Or are you saying that you're a very reasonable person? When have I ever killed someone without a reason?" Su Lu slowly narrowed his eyes and said in a low voice, "And don't people like you always say that there's no reason to speak of in the universe? It's more difficult to find you now than it is to see me, the president of the Federation. Don't you think it's very strange for a crown prince of the Empire to hide in the Federation? In the tavern, I promised Pabre that if you were to do what he did, I would treat you like I treated him. So I can't leave for now." Tai Yuan coughed lightly and said, "For an expert like you who can put his life on the line against an entire country as the president of the Federation, the most important thing for me to do is to kill you. These two were once best friends." Now that they met again at a barbecue stall on the street, they no longer had the tacit understanding and smiles of the past. There was only a tit-for-tat between words and bearing. The current you has become a bit unfamiliar. Su Lu was unable to remain harsh and cold for long. He quietly looked at Tai Yuan's increasingly thin cheeks and said, "Last time when I met with Chief Editor Bob, I mentioned a few things to him. He's very worried that you'll become the second Pabre. In a sense, Pabre is my teacher. I should have been learning from him since I was young, and I really am walking on his path. The difference between us is that he's too extreme. He's obsessed with destroying the existing order, but I'm not like that. Order can only collapse from within. I'll learn from his lesson and then do my best to do it steadily. In reality, the Federation's luck lies in the fact that I, who was born into the Tai family, am willing to walk on this path. In reality, this path can only be walked by me." Tai Yuan said, "Regardless of whether you and other people believe it or not, I always believe that the historical significance of me becoming the president of the Federation is precisely to completely eradicate the 7 great families for the future generations, to lay the most solid foundation." Su Lu quietly looked at him, as if he wanted to see if there were flowers on his face. Not silk flowers, but real flowers. Tai Yuan's expression slightly darkened, and he said, "And I want to repeat one point. You, as a person of the Empire, especially the Crown Prince of the Empire, have no right to discuss and interfere in the matters of the Federation. There are many things that get more troublesome the more you interfere, such as that president who once belonged to us. People like Pabre can either die or come to an agreement. He'll betray his own ideology. If you force him to send himself to prison, he'll instead feel the joy of martyrdom. So even if he's sentenced to life imprisonment, he won't be quiet just like that." Tai Zun unbuttoned his collar, looked at him mockingly, and said, "Do you know how troublesome this is? Some newspaper in the South has started to publish his diary, but can a damn diary save the country?" Su Lu raised his eyebrows, spread his hands, and said, "Don't ask me. I don't write diaries. There's one more thing. The Federation Investigation Bureau is monitoring Bob and what according to the law. If you dare to break the law again and kidnap and threaten those investigators, I'll order the Federation government to arrest you at all costs." "What law are you talking about according to the law? Is it the Citizens' Privacy Law or the Patriot Act that you abolished?" Su Lu stared into his eyes and said, "You used to run the Shizhou law firm. You and Pabre both know the law very well, so when the Capital Special District daily started to monitor you, you always found a way to deal with it. But I also want to remind you of one thing. I respect the laws of the Federation, but I respect some principles even more. As long as I'm here, there are some things that you can't do." He continued, "Without me, without Chief Editor Bob and Reporter Wood, would you be able to become the president? I'm not arrogant or anything. You know I'm not that kind of person. I just think that people should be honest, respectful, and grateful." Tai Ziyuan smiled and said, I've never admitted what you said about your contributions to the Federation. Without the help of Zhou Yu and Lin Banshan, you wouldn't have been able to do those things. Well, maybe it's a child's temper, but I won't admit it because you're a citizen of the Empire. What else can I say when you're using a child's temper to talk about things? I can only say that maybe one day in the future, someone will admit that I was and can be a citizen of the Federation. Su Lu picked up the bottle and filled the glass in front of him. He said in normal tone, As for you, I'll always keep an eye on you because we're best friends, so I don't have anything to be embarrassed about. If you do anything stupid, I'll kill you directly. It's really stressful to be your best friend. Tai Yuan grabbed the glass in front of him, rolled up his sleeves, and said lightly, But I believe you won't find a chance. Although you're the most famous moral trafficker, I believe that I'm the one with the true moral integrity. The fact that I betrayed my class means that I'm destined to be more perfect than you. Su Lu rubbed his hair and said angrily, You want to compare this? Just now, Master Fan of the Empire left this table. I can clearly say that the more perfect a person is, the more they deserve to be beaten. At this time, Li Wei came over with a large plate of ingredients. He put on the table and said softly, Mr. President, please try the plain porridge and scallion pancake, Donglin flavor. Tai Ziyuan looked at the plain porridge and scallion pancake in front of him. His fingers, which were rolling up his sleeves, froze slightly. He said in a daze, Get yourself a glass too. Let's have a drink. Su Lu raised his eyebrows and said, You dare to drink with this inferior synthetic body of yours. In this world, there were too few people who dared to speak to the president of the Federation with such a sarcastic tone. However, for Su Lu, he would only return to his youthful self in front of his closest friends. It didn't matter whether the other party was the president or not. But it was important to others, such as the deputy director of the Special Task Force, who was standing not far from the small wine table. After hearing Su Li's last sentence, which had been deliberately raised in volume, his expression changed drastically. He suddenly felt like he was humiliated by his superior, and he subconsciously tightened his grip on the handle of his gun. Li Wei, who had just finished delivering the plain porridge and scallion pancake, noticed this person's action. He narrowed his eyes and stared coldly at him, saying, If you don't want to die, then take the egg and scram. I'm not a gangster. I'm a civilized person. This sentence means that you should scram. Tai Ziyuan looked at the plain porridge and scallion pancake in front of him and thought of many things in the past. He thought of the fainting in the Mecha training room in Section H of the Yue University Library and the origin of the name of the Shizhou law firm he had opened. His expression became gentler, and he said, Why can't I drink? The young president, who was born in a prestigious family, raised the wine glass in front of him to his lips and took a sip slowly and reservedly, making the cheap beer taste like expensive Mouton red wine. Sula looked at him and smiled. He picked up an upside-down wine glass from the table beside him, filled it to the brim, and finished it in one gulp. The atmosphere around the small wine table became more harmonious. Let me remind you, people who don't get married are not perfect. The president especially needs to get married. Tai Ziyuan smiled and said, It's next month. The bride should be introduced by you, but as the matchmaker, you don't need to attend the wedding because I don't have a little dark room to entertain you. Bai Qi. Sula looked at him in surprise and asked, Where's the person you said you were going to get married to in autumn? It's a stupid family that only knows how to regret. Let's not talk about it. Su Lu smiled. Because of the name Bai Qi, he naturally thought of the coming-of-age ceremony. When he thought of the sickly guy opposite him who was gifted in a certain aspect, he suddenly felt a little ashamed. He quickly poured another glass of wine and took it away. He asked worriedly, What about her identity? I don't plan to hide it from the public. Don't you think this will be a good story? Did you have real feelings for her before? Su Lu asked with a frown. Tai Ziyuan looked at him quietly. Suddenly, he laughed and asked, You have so many women. Who do you have feelings for? Su Lu knew how to answer. He raised his wine glass and toasted. No matter what, you've let her follow you for so many years. You're very manly. Tai Ziyuan took a sip and continued to ask, What are you going to do with your side? Sulu lowered his head and answered, "You said that I'm from the Empire. The nobles of the Empire can have many wives, not to mention that I'm a member of the royal family. So if they're all willing, then I'll take them all." Taizuan thought of the identities of those women and raised his glass in return. He sighed and said, "You're the real man." At this point in the banquet, the atmosphere was harmonious, and it was suitable to talk about serious business. "Do you have any suggestions for the negotiations with the Empire?" "That princess is indeed your sister. She's as tough and stubborn as you. She doesn't see any room for compromise. I don't understand these things. Not understanding is not a good excuse to get out of trouble. Peace is what you want, so you have to work hard for it. I can tell you that the Federation's bottom line is that we can't go back to the Cali corridor. Also, we must get the X3 crystal mine in our hands." Sulu looked into Tai Ziyuan's eyes and said, "This is equivalent to asking the Empire to cede a starfield. You know how difficult it is. Why would the other side accept it? The spatial passage of the Cali corridor is an anti-funnel. You should know very well that you've been here many times. Now that the Empire's fleet has the ability to travel through space, how will the Federation defend the other side of the funnel? So, our first line of defense must be on the other side of the passage. The Cali corridor is basically a barren star field. The Empire has no effective control over it. What's wrong with giving it to us? Of course, for the sake of each other's faces, we can use the name of joint resource exploitation. As for the X3 system, Shanglin is not a world like the left sky star field, where communication between star systems is not necessary. Without the crystal mine, the Federation will collapse. I can even agree to let both sides jointly manage it. My side will pay the corresponding amount of mining in the form of a lease." Sulu listened in silence. Only now did he ask, "Have you ever thought that these negotiation terms are all concessions from the Empire? The Federation has won this war. That's the main point. Is there any meaning to this? Fine, even if there's no meaning, we can pay a large sum of money in the form of resources. If the Empire wants to call it war reparations, I have no objections. That sounds feasible." Sulu frowned and asked, "What about the emotions of both sides? After fighting for almost 100 years, hatred is not so easy to erase. The Empire is about to die. Can't they be allowed to have some emotions? But since it seems that the Empire will never die, then their emotions will naturally become better." Taizuan said calmly. "As for the Empire, with the imperial family's unyielding style and habit of ruling with iron and blood, when have you ever cared about the emotions of the people?" Sulu did not care about his mockery, and said with emotion, "Even if the peace talks are successful this time, who knows when the next war between the Federation and the Empire will begin?" Tai Zuan also began to feel emotional. Maybe a decade, maybe a few decades, or even a few centuries. By then, we no longer need to care about these things. Or maybe we can't care about them in our graves. We'll just leave it to the more intelligent descendants to deal with. His emotional voice suddenly stopped. He looked at Sulu and said, "Actually, I really want to completely defeat the Empire. However, the problem now is that you can't just watch the Federation forces invade Tianjing planet and attack that supposedly magnificent palace. You also don't die easily, so other than negotiating, I have no other choice." Su Li's hand, that was holding the wine glass, froze slightly. He smiled and said, "Looks like I'm still useful." Tai Zuan said calmly, "You could have been more useful." Sula knew what this meant. After a moment of silence, he said, "The Federation promised to provide the Empire with the technology to manufacture synthetic meat. I'll try to convince them." "That's impossible," Tai Zuan said firmly. Sula looked at him and said seriously, "There are many commoners and slaves at the bottom of the left sky star region. Their lives are really miserable, and many of them don't have enough to eat." Tai Zuan replied, "But the manufacture of synthetic meat is within the scope of the charter. The government has no authority over it. The charter can also be changed. I'll go and convince others. You go and try to convince the Bureau of Proclamation. After all, Lin Banshan is the acting director now. Settle this matter before he returns to Bermuda. To him, there are no rules that cannot be broken." Tai Yuan said after a moment of silence. I'll go and try. Sulu held the wine bottle and poured him a full glass seriously. He said, I recently learned a lot of sayings and proverbs before the great calamity. Some are really interesting. For example, something about accumulating good karma. If this matter is done, your future generations will be blessed. Tai Yuan was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he said, I won't have any descendants. Why? The Tai family, which has been passed down for generations, will end in my generation. Tai Yuan slowly drank the wine in his glass. He wiped the corner of his mouth with a white silk handkerchief. He said calmly, You don't have to rush to persuade me. I'm not a real lunatic like Li Jie-du. Naturally, I won't self-sterilize the crown prince of the Tai family just to realize my life's dream. Then why? Sulu said angrily, You're sick. Tai Yuan looked at him with a smile. He said, I really am sick. After the assassination in the gymnasium, you were sent to the general hospital. The doctor diagnosed you with epilepsy. At that time, I gave you a bottle of medicine. I don't know if you still remember. I think I remember, but I didn't take it. From the moment I was born, I always carried that bottle of medicine with me. Back then, when I fainted in the computer battle room in the library, it was the same reason. I'm sick. Sulu frowned and looked at him. He asked, What kind of illness? Hereditary illness. It's a genetic illness that the medical community couldn't find the cause even after searching for tens of thousands of years. It has a very long professional name, but it also has a very simple name. It's called Tai's disease. Because in the entire Federation, only the people of the Tai family have this illness. From the moment the Tai family is born, the nerves in the brain often show abnormal electrical discharge. It's very similar to epilepsy, but it's more troublesome because the doctors can't find the cause. The onset of the illness is very painful, and the brain shrinks faster than normal people. The lifespan is also not very long. That's why my father died early, and I've never seen my grandfather. Tai Yuan shrugged, which was very rare. He said self-deprecatingly, This illness doesn't always bring bad consequences. Because of the abnormal electrical discharge in the brain, although there are only a few people in our family since ancient times, every generation is indeed an extremely outstanding genius. Sulu looked at him in shock. He held the wine glass tightly and couldn't say anything. However, such a life is ultimately cursed by the Creator, right? Tai Yuan looked at the lights in the distance quietly and said calmly, That's why I won't have children. I'll let this pain and curse end in my generation. But old Director Tai is already in his 90s. Sulu suddenly waved his arm and said loudly, as if he had grabbed a life-saving rope. Li Yuan said calmly, The old director is my family's only distant relative for 7 generations, but not many people know that he was adopted. My mother has always felt guilty towards him, precisely because he was unwilling to have more sons back then, but instead adopted a bunch of daughters. See Chapter 219 of Volume 4 for details for the last time. But there has to be some way, right? Sulu said with a frown. You've seen so many deaths. Don't you understand? Tai Yuan said with a smile. I don't care about these things. There are many reasons why I chose Bai Qi as my marriage partner. After all, we were just making a deal in the beginning. Then, when I die or leave, her pain might be reduced. Sulu shook his head. He looked at the empty wine glass and said softly, I don't think so. Tai Yuan looked at him and said firmly, I'm also a person who refuses to bow to fate. Because my life is shorter than others, I must become the youngest president of the Federation. After completing my term, I will do what I really want to do. I want to go to the deepest part of the universe. Even if I die, I want to die there. Back then, I told you on the beach that my goal is the sea of stars. What will Madam think of this matter? Women are always more troublesome, whether it's your mother, your wife, or the many wives in your future life. But in the end, these troubles have to be solved by men. Looking at the thin and bleak back of the young president of the Federation as he left, Sulu immediately contacted the old man and confirmed a fact that made him speechless. It turned out that the ancestor of the Tai family was the most inconspicuous person beside the statues in Charter Square. During the Great Catastrophe, when the spaceship evacuated from the ancestral planet, the ancestor of the Tai family was the last person to evacuate from the planetary observatory. Therefore, he was severely exposed to radiation and left behind sequelae in his body. This sequelae had a severe impact on the biological marker structure in his body. This effect could even be passed down, turning into a genetic disease that was like a curse. When the group of 5 decided on the order of human society after death, they took into consideration that the fragile human society at that time needed to develop the 3-4-star region, which was still a wilderness and needed more effective administrative efficiency. Therefore, they chose the imperial system, which was convenient to centralize power, and when they chose the first emperor, they chose a descendant of the Tai family ancestor and a newborn female. The reason why they chose the descendant of the Tai family was probably because the 5 of them, including the ancestor of the Tai family, knew very well that the Tai family bloodline couldn't be passed down for too long and too wide. Therefore, even if the descendant of the Tai family wanted to continue the imperial system in the future, they would encounter innate difficulties. Although the tenacity of the Tai family's life force allowed the Tai family bloodline to be passed down for far longer than they expected, in a sense, the group of 5 still succeeded in their calculations. However, the analysis of this choice in hindsight was a bit too cruel. After a long silence, Su Lu said, "Perhaps the group of 5 felt that the Tai family ancestor had sacrificed too much in order to evacuate the ancestral planet, so they chose his descendant as the new emperor of the human society as compensation. Perhaps it would be more pleasant to look at things in a simpler way. Why can't we think of things in a more positive way?" To the human society in the midst of war, the most beautiful moment, the most beautiful scene was actually very simple. That was the soldiers on the front lines, who had experienced the test of death every day, finally returned home safely and were reunited with their loved ones with tears in their eyes. The negotiations between the Federation and the Empire were still in a painful state, but the Empire's Tianjin television station had already started broadcasting related news. The great Emperor Fuchai, who rarely appeared in public, appeared on the walls of the Imperial Palace. With a calm gaze, he inspected the orderly formation of retired frontline soldiers who walked through the palace gates with their heads held high. The Empire's news said, under the leadership of the great emperor, under the joint efforts of the Beijing royal family, nobles, and brave warriors of all ranks, the Empire obtained the final victory of this war. The cowardly Federation will soon have to pay a huge amount of war reparations to redeem the peace that was given out. The Tianjin planet on the news was a sea of celebration. The nobles in luxurious clothes pulled up the slave soldiers who had returned from the front lines and knelt in front of them, hugging them like brothers. Then, they announced in public that because of the heroic battle achievements and scars of the slave soldiers, they would give them precious gifts. Similar scenes kept appearing in the Empire's news, but the Federation citizens naturally did not see it. They also did not know that the financial support plan for the barbaric aboriginals and slaves of the backward star regions, that had just been passed with great difficulty by the Parliament Hill, had directly turned into a huge amount of war reparations from the Empire. At this moment, almost all the television screens in the Federation were broadcasting a documentary. This documentary, filmed by the Venus Documentary Film Studio, was called The Soldier Returns Home. A second lieutenant carrying a heavy military backpack returned from the front lines. He walked into the kindergarten nervously, trying to recognize the girl playing a tabletop Scrabble game on the screen as his daughter that he had not seen for 2 years. Under the gentle reminder of the teacher, he smiled and squatted down, opening his arms. A cute black-haired girl looked over in a daze. Suddenly, she covered her mouth and screamed. Like a little bird, she threw herself into the arms of the father. No matter how the camera around her filmed, she hugged her father's neck tightly, as if she was worried that he would disappear again. The girl stuck close to the second lieutenant's face and said softly, "Daddy, I miss you." Tao Xiaoli was a female clerk in a trading company in the port city. Today was her birthday, but she was not in a good mood. This was because her beloved boyfriend was serving at the front lines in the Left Star region and would not return for another 3 months. While she was eating cake and blowing out candles, her boyfriend might be hiding in a narrow alloy tunnel to avoid the wind, rain, or even missiles outside. He could die at any moment. She rejected a male colleague's dinner invitation and returned to the apartment alone. Throwing away her handbag and slippers, she leaned against the sofa tiredly. Rubbing her hair with both hands, she looked at the empty room and thought of those beautiful old days. Her expression was lonely and sad. At this moment, the door of the utility room was pushed open. More than a dozen colleagues pushed in a cake cart full of candles and sang the birthday song. She looked over there in surprise. Her hands were on her chest, and she did not know what to say. She was moved, but she could not help but feel a little regretful. It would be great if he was here. As if the Creator had heard her silent prayer, the colleagues around the cake cart dispersed. A handsome young man, wearing a Federation military vest, walked over with flowers in his hands. Tao Xiaoli's hands that were on her chest suddenly grasped her clothes. She looked at that face in disbelief. She slowly walked over and hugged him tightly. She kept kissing his face and lips with tears flowing down her face. Note: the above two concepts are from a video on the internet. This is the last note. There is a blurry old video in the documentary, God knows how many years ago, in front of that shabby Red Oil restaurant. A 4-year-old girl saw a general walking over in the sunset. She screamed and rushed over, jumping up and hugging the general's neck. The general in his prime was not burly, but he was very strong. The little girl hugged his neck and shook him while giggling. Her neatly cut black hair was like a watermelon skin. There was a new video in the documentary. One day in the late spring, the camera followed a Federation field officer who was severely disabled in a wheelchair as he climbed up the multi-story irrigation farm with difficulty. On the top floor of the farm, the man in the wheelchair looked at the girl and said while panting, "I have 2 good news for you. The first is that I just set a federal speed record for climbing up the 13th floor of the irrigated farm in a wheelchair. Of course, no one has done this before. The second thing is, dear, Uncle Xiao agreed to our relationship." In front of the irrigation farm, the girl wearing an apron and a headscarf looked at him in surprise. Then, she raised her hands and covered her face, crying silently. In these scenes that made countless people of the Federation burst into tears, the director of the documentary inserted a live news broadcast from several years ago in an extremely obscure or perhaps sinister way. There are only a few frames of that video, which basically flashed by when it was broadcasted. Unless someone was bored enough to count the frames very slowly and watch them one by one, no one would see them. It was the scene of welcoming the Federation hero back from the Imperium. When the small-eyed man in the Federation military uniform walked out of the cabin door of the warship, the capital airport was filled with joy. There were also some real interviews in the documentary. The subjects were all Federation soldiers who had returned from the front line or their families. A colonel of the Federation looked at the camera and said, "My name is Ning He. I'm an advisor of the staff of the 1st Military Region. I serve in the front line for less than a year, so it's a pity that I didn't get any military medals." The young woman beside him with a sweet smile said to the camera, "My name is Xiaoli. I'm Ning He's wife. I don't want any military medals. I just want him to come back." Under the direct instructions of the government, the film crew with a military background even surprisingly interviewed General Du Xiaoqing, the former commander of the Federation enemy, who had just returned from the front line. In the warm welcome ceremony at the capital airport, the camera was following the famous general of the Federation wearing sunglasses. The camera was shaking violently. In the midst of the noise, the reporter desperately asked, "General, how does it feel to be home?" Du Xiaoqing turned his head and took off his sunglasses. After a moment of silence, he said, "It feels good." At the end of the documentary, it was still edited by Bob and drafted by the former chairman of the General Staff Council, General Myers, who had retired many years ago, personally wrote a sentence. "We remember the heroes because they allowed us to live without heroes. So, please let us welcome the heroes back home." Chapter 990. The documentary Soldier Goes Home was produced by the Golden Star Film Studio. It was the latest work of the great director by Zeming after The New Journey of Mankind. After it was broadcasted on the Federation News Channel, it immediately set off a ratings frenzy. Although it was considered too sentimental and vulgar by some sharp and mean critics, this documentary was still nominated for many important awards in the Nebula Awards. However, it certainly could not break the record of his most famous documentary. However, two documentaries were nominated for the Nebula Awards at the same time. This was already a record that was difficult for future generations to reach. One night, a man and a woman who had been engaged in private for a long time, but had been separated for even longer, met again in the woods beside Robbie Avenue. They gave each other gifts that represented their feelings. The man's gift was a bottle of Polonia red wine, and the woman's gift was a bracelet. Jian Shui'er took off the bracelet with a smile and hung it on Su Li's wrist. It nestled together with the bracelet. The silver light reflected on each other, and a few lines of small words could be clearly seen. Su Li looked at the face that was still beautiful, but more charming than before. He awkwardly raised the wine bottle and said, "I didn't know what to give you. You said on the battleship that it was your first blind date. At that time, you drank several bottles, so I chose this." Jian Shui'er smiled and walked forward into his arms. She hugged his strong waist and leaned against his chest. She whispered, "At that time, I thought the wine was a bit bland, but I like it now." Su Li lowered his head and gently kissed her lips. At the moment of contact, he remembered that this love was really dreamy. It was even as unreal and fleeting as a dream. Because of the twists and turns of fate, the two of them didn't have time to enjoy the taste of love. But what was love? Was it the feeling of being moved? He had been moved before and was still moved. Whether it was hugging, kissing, or just looking at her, his heart would beat faster. It was just like when he first saw the lonely nanny on TV outside the tavern when he was a child. It was just like when he saw the purple-haired female captain for the first time night after night. It was just like when he saw the real her for the first time at the concert in Linhai State Gymnasium. It was just like when he woke up from a dark dream and saw the sun shining through her white dress and her tube top. It was just like when he hugged her tightly for the first time in the stuffy cockpit. They walked hand in hand through the woods by the Boulevard Robbie and entered the still brightly lit Supreme Court of the Federation. The Supreme Court of the Federation never heard cases at night and had no duty to witness marriages, but today the Supreme Court of the Federation was waiting for a couple. There were very few people in the Supreme Court. There were no relatives, friends, or news reporters. Other than the old man sitting at the chief judge's seat, there were only two staff members in charge of taking photos and archiving. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Federation, He Ying, sat there drowsily, giving off a sense of oppression. He was truly an old man who could use time to suppress great power. Su Li held Jian Shui'er's hand and said seriously, "A simple wedding cannot be made public and can only be held at night. It is indeed not grand and formal enough. I hope there will be a chance to make up for it in the future." Jian Shui'er smiled and said, "I have experienced too many grand and formal occasions over the years." The old judge in the courtroom suddenly opened his eyes and quickly woke up from his drowsy state. He looked at the man and woman below the courtroom and scolded unhappily. Holding a ceremony in the Supreme Court with the Chief Justice of the Federation as the witness of the marriage, is this not grand and official enough? The judge, whose face was full of age spots, stared coldly at Su Li's face as if he was looking at scum. He said with an old voice, "The Supreme Court has never done a wedding ceremony before, so I am not familiar with the procedure. Of course, if you do a few more weddings in the future, perhaps we will be more familiar with it." This was obviously a severe accusation against someone's moral standards, but Su Li could not refute it. For some reason, he even heard a hint of killing intent, so he lowered his head like a criminal. The judge said indifferently, "There's another problem. One of you is from the Federation, and the other is from the Empire. How are you going to get married? The marriage law of the Federation has an additional clause for marriage with Bermuda, but there is no additional clause for marriage with the Empire." Su Li was stunned. He scratched his head and said awkwardly, "Do I have to find a way to let the Federation pass a resolution to allow marriage between the Federation and the Empire? Idiot, can't you say that you are from the Federation?" The judge looked at him as if he was looking at a stupid pig and scolded without any trace of politeness. "Where is the IQ of a genius engineer?" "But I am indeed from the Empire," Sulu replied very honestly. "You can keep your Empire citizenship." Sulu looked at the judge in shock and said, "You can do that? If I say you can do that, then you can do that." The old judge said angrily, "Who in the Federation dares to question my jurisprudence? There was no dual citizenship in the past, but there will definitely be in the future." Sulu took a deep breath and felt his body suddenly relax. He silently said to that fellow in the official residence, "In the end, I've been recognized as a member of the Federation." The ceremony entered the formal part. Judge Hiying, wearing his reading glasses, looked at the template that had just been downloaded from the internet and read it word by word. "Citizen of the Federation, Sulu, are you sure that you love Jian Shuai and want to take her as your wife?" "Yes." Sulu held Jian Shuai's hand and replied, "When I was very young, I told myself that I wanted to take Jian Shuai as my wife." After the ceremony ended, Jian Shuai went to the side to take a single registration photo. Only Sulu remained in front of the judge's stand, and he couldn't help but feel somewhat nervous. There were too few people in the world that could make him nervous, and the chief judge on the stand was definitely the first. He didn't understand why, but he recalled a proverb he had learned from the old thing before the great calamity: "One can be strong without desires." The reason why he revered the chief judge was probably because he had always stood on the side of selflessness to help him. "Sulu, come to the stand," the old judge said. Sulu obeyed and walked to the front of the stand. "I'm warning you, if you dare to ask me to hold a wedding ceremony for you with another woman in the future, I will immediately fall out with you." The old judge's wrinkles were filled with undisguised intimidation, but in the next moment, his expression instantly became complicated. He said softly, "Of course, I also know that all men are like this. As long as you don't ask me to hold a wedding ceremony, I'll pretend that I didn't see it. Why did I insist that you keep your Empire citizenship? Because the people of the Empire can marry many wives." Unfortunately, Jian Shuai had just returned at this time. When she heard this, the beautiful bride raised her eyebrows slightly. She looked at the banquet and said angrily, "Old man, do you not want to listen to my story anymore? You're already over 100 years old, and you're still so reckless." The old judge laughed awkwardly and then said seriously, "Who said I'm over 100 years old? I'm only 95 this year. Have you ever heard of the saying, 738,495? I'm a dying man, so what's the point of being angry with me? Be good and continue your stories tomorrow." At this moment, he glanced at his watch and patted his chest with some lingering fear. "It's past 12. My birthday is over. I'm officially 96 years old. It seems that I won't die so easily." Sulu looked at the old judge on the stand and said very sincerely, "When you decided the Zhong family property case, I already wished you a long life." This wish is too insincere. The old judge waved his hand and said, 100 years is too short. Some people thought that 100 years was too short, while others thought that 100 years was too long. In the canteen of Qingcheng military prison, a dark-skinned middle-aged prisoner was giving a lesson to other prisoners. He waved his arms, and his deep voice sounded very persuasive. The former president of the Federation, Pabre, who had been sentenced to a long term of imprisonment, was still resolutely continuing his struggle. "We are prisoners, but we still have relevant personal rights. For example, the right to not wear electronic shackles. This action by the prison seriously violates the Anti-Torture Act of the Federation. We have the right to receive guests, and we should also fight for our own political rights." The old prisoners who were still alive looked at him indifferently. Someone said mockingly, "The people here either have a reprieve or an indefinite sentence. What's the use of fighting for those rights?" Pabre looked at that person with a smile and said, "How can it be useless? It's always more comfortable to not wear shackles. Now there are more newspapers and magazines that everyone can read. I can even stand here and give lessons to everyone. We have to fight for our own rights." An old prisoner in the corner said with a hoarse voice, "That's fine. Mr. President, you've indeed fought for a lot of benefits for us. But what's the use of political governance? It's better to ask the prison management to give us some pornographic CDs. What's that called? Sexual rights, right?" A burst of ear-piercing laughter rang out in the canteen. Pabre also laughed and said, "Political rights are the right to vote. Although we don't have many votes, it's very likely that they are the most important votes. If we have the right to vote, we can vote for those who support the idea of leniency or those who believe that the prison budget should be cut and the number of prisoners should be reduced. Then maybe there will be pornographic magazines sent to prison one day. Maybe there will even be a day when you can walk out of prison." The prison gradually quieted down. The sinister old prisoners seemed to have started to think seriously. The bell rang. Under the close watch of the military police, Pabre was escorted back to his solitary cell. According to the schedule, he did 20 consecutive prostrations and drank a glass of water. Then he sat back at the table and began to write letters to the members of parliament at all levels. His gaze moved from the fiber letter to the picture frame in front of the table. In the picture frame, Pabre was looking at him with a sweet smile. Pabre smiled slightly. He silently calculated in his mind how many days it would be until the visiting date and how many years it would be before he could be released from prison. During the negotiations between the Federation and the Empire, it was claimed that there was a temporary truce. In fact, there were still conflicts on the surface of some planets. In order to fight for chips at the negotiating table for their side, no side would choose to wait in silence at this time. In a military camp, dozens of soldiers surrounded the major battalion commander who had just led them through the encirclement and safely returned home. They expressed their gratitude at once. A subordinate asked curiously, "Battalion commander, are all the officers who were recruited through the special recruitment program of the Ministry of Defense as fierce as you? They even dared to climb down such a steep cliff?" The battalion commander said with a cigarette in his mouth, "I used to be in the Federation Investigation Bureau. I didn't receive military training. On the battlefield, as long as you can understand one sentence, you will be qualified." "What sentence?" "Except for life and death, it's all F***king nonsense." "Brilliant." Battalion commander. "I also heard this sentence from someone else." "Who?" "Colonel Sulo." After a long silence, a soldier asked in shock, "Battalion commander, you know such a big shot?" The battalion commander spat out the bitter cigarette in his mouth, raised his chin, and said proudly, "Nonsense. Do I have to tell you that I have interrogated him?" Several of the Federation's top socialites, who were usually very proud, thought of the fawning smile of the logistics director of the Samlin United Bank and realized that the seemingly inconspicuous chairman of the club in front of them actually had a very deep background. One of them said with a fawning smile, "Sister Lulu, I didn't expect you to be so capable." Sister Lulu, who was wearing a backless dress, held a cigarette with 2 fingers. Looking at the cold faces of the crowd, a charming look suddenly appeared in her eyes. She said, "Nonsense. Do I have to tell you girls that I have slept with the crown prince of the empire?" Every once in a while, Dr. Jiang Rue, who would be beaten up for no reason when he was thought of by those men, finally couldn't bear this eternal torture anymore. He summoned his courage and walked into the inpatient building of the Army General Hospital. He entangled with a female nurse and cried bitterly, "My Huang Linyao, can you get off work and eat?" Li family's 7th young master, Li Xiaotong, walked over with a large bouquet of golden sunflowers in his hands. After succeeding Li Xiaozhu as the president of the Samlin United Bank, the yin and cold aura around his body was even stronger than before. However, in front of that female nurse named Huang Li, the yin and cold aura around his body would mysteriously fade without washing away. It was probably because that year in that clubhouse he had forgotten the name of. When he first saw her, he saw her use her small hands to slap that heartless man to her heart's content. From the wind of her palms and the shadow of her fingers, he tasted the biting cold flavor that he liked the most. So it was hard for him, to forget. Looking at the scene in front of him, Li Xiaodong's face became cold again. Huang Li cutely stuck out her tongue and took the sunflowers. She took his arm and walked to the elevator. When the elevator door was about to close, she couldn't help but look at Dr. Jiang Rui with great sympathy. Brother Zeng, who stood silently behind Li Xiaotong, didn't leave. Instead, he slowly walked toward Jiang Rui. His hair was already white, but it was still like a cold gun. She was a famous young female member of the Federation. She was still the elegant and charming Leaf of Green Dragon Mountain. Her subordinates in the Parliament Mountain had all heard of that legendary story, but they had never heard her mention it. Occasionally, after a certain weekend, the waiter would see 2 red wine glasses and a jar of foam in the bathroom. She was Zhang Xiaoming. A strange professor came to Yue University. This professor's hair was messy like a bird's nest, his eyes were always bloodshot, and his body was extremely thin. He looked like an old rabbit that had slept for too long. This professor never hid the fact that he had lived in a mental hospital for a long time. He insisted that the real geniuses of the Federation were all locked up in the mental hospital by the government. He also insisted that his IQ was higher than Su Lu and Shang Xiao, the 2 legendary engineers put together, because he said that if his name was understood in ancient letters, it meant better person. He was Bateman. The Empire's army completely recovered the Mo Hua planet. The almost ruined Fiji city regained some signs of life. The miners and slaves who had been hiding in the cellars and attics, for who knew how long, finally crawled out. They were originally very worried that they would be attacked and hurt again by the stray soldiers, but they didn't expect that the army that entered the city would be exceptionally disciplined. That was because there was a beautiful girl leading the military police to patrol day and night. In this city that couldn't take any more damage, no matter how barbaric the army was, they were as obedient and pure as mice in front of this military police. This was because this was the military police directly under His Highness, and everyone in the Empire's military knew that this beautiful girl was His Highness' most trusted subordinate. Fiji was her hometown, Shed Kabinovich was her grandfather, and she was Uzra. A battleship full of bullet marks landed in a military base somewhere in S3. A tall and sturdy young Federation general walked out. The muscles under his military uniform were filled with violent strength, as if they could tear his uniform into pieces at any time. The young general unceremoniously refused the invitation of the 3 military chiefs to dinner, and then drove a military off-road vehicle alone, speeding towards a certain deep mountain. On the road, less than 400 kilometers before arriving at the mountain villa, he rushed into a toll booth that tried to collect money, smashed a vehicle charging station that tampered with the counter, broke the thigh bones of 4 robbers, crashed 17 expensive rides of rich kids who were racing on ordinary roads, and saved a girl who jumped into the lake in a wedding dress because of relationship problems. He also didn't hesitate to slap the girl twice in the face and refused to leave his name and any contact information. The tattered military off-road vehicle finally drove into the secluded villa in the mountain. The young general knocked on the door, but there was no answer, so he kicked open the heavy and solid alloy door without hesitation and walked up the stairs to the balcony on the 2nd floor. He looked at the middle-aged man who was playing the violin and said in a deep voice, "Are you really going to turn yourself into a poor and artistic middle-aged man?" Including the invincible Huai Chaosher of the Empire, there were not many people in the world who dared to speak to the middle-aged man in such a tone. Other than the small-eyed officer in the training base, there was probably only this young general with a violent temperament. It was because he had been invincible since he joined the army at the age of 12. It was because the golden stars on his mecha's legs represented his military exploits were mottled and dazzling. It was because he was the proudest successor of the 37th Constitutional Federation. It was because he was willing to sacrifice his lifespan to undergo electroshock stimulation in order to protect this federation. It was because his temper had always been this violent, and it was because he was Madman Li. At the edge of the balcony, the middle-aged man put down the violin in his hand. His expression was still as cold and calm as on the battlefield, as if he was still the famous general of the Federation who had dominated the constellation. However, he no longer wore his iconic sunglasses today and had changed into casual clothes. He smiled and said, "It's not that I've changed, but that I've always been an artistic youth. Now that I'm older, I've naturally become an artistic middle-aged man." Li Feng furrowed his thin brows, stared at him, and said, "What on earth are you thinking about?" "I'm not thinking about anything. Or rather, I've come back because I've thought things through." Li Feng's brows furrowed even tighter and sharper as he asked in a deep voice, "What have you thought things through?" The middle-aged man looked at him and said calmly, "A few years ago, Su Li's identity as a person from the Empire was exposed. In the wilderness beside the high-speed rail, when my troops were under orders to hunt him down, Su Lu once cursed at me furiously. 'You're the F***king person from the Empire.' In response, you mocked and cursed back, 'If Su Lu is a person from the Empire, then I'm a F***king woman.'" Li Feng's furrowed brows gradually smoothed out, and he asked in disbelief, "If you still hold this grudge, I'll apologize to you solemnly." However, the situation back then was different. Who would believe that he was a person from the Empire? That's right. Who would believe that? The middle-aged man suddenly laughed. Just like who would believe that my mother was really a person from the Empire, a woman from the Empire? Li Feng's eyes suddenly widened, and he could not believe what he had just heard. "I didn't understand before, but after seeing Su Lu return to the Federation, I vaguely understood. She probably wouldn't want to see me avenge her in this way. There is a woman from the Empire who had a miserable life. She was the descendant of a noble who had been cruelly purged in the Empire. She was conscripted into the military camp at the age of 7. At first, she was washing clothes for those stinky soldiers, and then at the age of 9, she was transferred to the fleet of the West Woods Expeditionary Force. At that time, it would take almost 7 years for the Imperial Expeditionary Force to reach the West Woods. The vast universe, the unknown dangers, and the monotonous long years on the ship could easily drive people crazy. The low-level soldiers who did not have much education could barely hold on with the iron of discipline and the brainwashing of the Royal Disciplinary Group. But the nobles, and even the royal officers who led the expeditionary force seriously lacked such self-discipline and other methods of discipline. Therefore, they needed alcohol, and they needed women even more. Therefore, before the expedition, they would deliberately bring very young female slaves, waiting for those young female slaves to gradually grow up in the long journey. The nobles liked this kind of taste. Of course, this was a serious violation of military discipline. The royal family of the Empire even used the law of beheading as a severe warning. However, it still could not stop those noble officers from secretly bringing young female slaves onto the fleet. In the end, it even evolved into a practice of some very powerful nobles. The woman from the Empire was such a young female slave. In the 7 long years of the long journey, she turned from 9 to 16, from a young girl to a bright young girl, and then, unsurprisingly, became the sex toy of a certain general. The Imperial Expeditionary Force arrived at Planet 5460 West Woods of the Federation. After a fierce battle, they occupied the northern hemisphere of the planet, and the girl was transferred to the ground. Almost half of her short teenage life was spent in endless darkness and humiliation. The Empire girl suffered silently, praying that the Creator would give her a relatively better future, that she could return safely to her hometown, and then marry a commoner who did not despise her. No, even if it was a lowly slave, as long as he did not beat her. It would be fine, however, after eavesdropping on the general who despised her for being a piece of wood and wanted to throw her into a military brothel. The Empire girl felt the unbearable darkness for the first time. She stole a pair of anti-cold military boots, wrapped herself in 3 layers of blankets, and took a dozen pancakes to escape from the Empire camp, crossing the long primeval forest in the ice and snow, and fled to the south. In such a cold and cruel environment, such a terrifying and gloomy road, the girl actually walked out of the primeval forest in such an incredible way and arrived at a place with human habitation. At that time, Among the federal forces stationed at the front line, there was a unit of the 7th Mechanic Division from the 2nd Military Region. There was an officer in the 7th Mechanic Division, surnamed Du. He met the thin and weak girl who was about to die from the cold and the snow at the edge of the forest. He knew that she was from the Empire, but he could not bear to hand her over to the intelligence agency, because she was just a poor girl who was about to die. So, Officer Du built a small treehouse for her in the forest and moved in a warm bedding. Every few days, when it was his turn to patrol at night, he would hide the rations that he had saved for several days and send them to the treehouse. Occasionally, when he had time, he would even make small talk with hand gestures. Just like that, a low-level officer of the Federation and a low-level military brothel of the Empire fell in love with each other on the planet full of traces and smoke, because love was simple in the first place. Love was such a simple and beautiful thing. The Empire girl, whose body was gradually recovering, felt happy for the first time in her life. She began to hum the songs of her hometown and wait for the arrival of the figure in the treehouse every day. She began to learn a few simple words in the Federation language. She began to pick up straight branches in the forest, then peeled off the bark and polished it with stones. She ate the mutton that the man caught, spun the wool of the mutton, and knitted a sweater for the man. Officer Du was a man with a dull temperament. He only knew how to find the thickest branch he could carry so that the treehouse could be stronger. He only knew how to pick up the linoleum so that the woman would be warmer when she was waiting for him. He only knew how to steal a lot of old newspapers so that the woman could have something to do when she was bored. However, he forgot that she did not understand the language of the Federation. Many times he could not walk out of the military camp, so he kept writing in his diary with a pen. He wrote down the bits and pieces after he met her, recorded the gradual growth of the treehouse, and recorded the difficult process of making the sweater. Finally, he began to record the appearance of his first child growing in her arms. He kept the diary very well and locked it so that no one would know about it. 10 months passed peacefully just like that. When the child was about to be born, the Empire girl had difficulty giving birth because of the pain and suffering she had suffered for many years. Looking at the woman moaning in pain in the treehouse with sweat all over her face, Officer Du did not hesitate at all. He gritted his teeth and ran to the military camp. He did not care that he would be severely punished by military discipline. He only cared that she had to live. However, it was in that night full of blood and death that the final battle of the 2nd Federation defensive battle broke out. 3 Empire regiments violently attacked the defense line where the 7th Division was stationed. The 7th Division's headquarters missed the opportunity, leading to a fatal flaw in the federal military plan, and the 7th Division itself was surrounded by 3 Empire regiments. That battle was particularly tragic for the 7th Division. There was no military doctor, no military discipline, and not even a superior. Officer Du could not find anything but corpses all over the mountains. In the early hours of the morning, when he risked death to return to the treehouse, the child had already been born. She used her teeth to bite off the bloody umbilical cord. She placed the child in her naked arms, but she had closed her eyes forever, so the newborn cried sadly and powerlessly. Not many people in the 7th Division survived that battle, and Officer Du was one of them. He took the child back to the Capitol Ring on a battleship and reported that the child was an orphan he found in the home of the pioneering immigrants in 5460. The child's parents were already dead. Because of the need for publicity, the 7th Division became the hero Iron 7th Division. But Officer Du chose to retire with the child in his arms. Then, a few years later, he left the world with endless guilt and fear. Mixed bloods were often outstanding, and this was even more so for those of the Federation and the Empire. As the child grew up, he gradually revealed his own excellence. He entered the Capital University affiliated high school, graduated first, and entered the Federation's first military academy. He studied hard and lived seriously because he heard his father talk about that battle when he was young. He knew that the honor of the Iron 7th Division was a shame that his father could never bear. He always thought that his father died of depression because of that tragic victory. When he returned home in his first year of college, He accidentally saw the diary left by his father. He read it all night and was shocked by the words. After that, he cried and never cried again. He finally knew that the shame in his father's wrinkles was not only because he was ashamed of his dead comrades, but also because he was ashamed of his mother who died in childbirth. He finally knew that his mother was a lowly military prostitute of the Empire, who would look down on their mother. He would not. Although he felt a little inferior after that, he was more proud of his mother, who could cross the primeval forest in the wind and snow with a blanket and a pancake. That was his most amazing mother. As a result, he studied harder and harder, and his performance became more and more outstanding. There was once a girl in school who secretly expressed that she liked him, and he also silently liked her. However, he never responded to her feelings until he saw her holding the hand of another equally outstanding man. He did not respond because of that little bit of inferiority and that little bit of pride in his bones. More importantly, it was because he knew in his heart that his life was dedicated to the dangerous battlefield. It was very likely that he would die in the war between the Federation and the Empire. He wanted to clear the name of his father who died of depression and let the Iron 7th Division obtain true glory. He wanted to avenge his mother who had lived a miserable life. He wanted to lead the army into the Empire and destroy that evil world. He wanted to turn all the nobles of the Empire and that dog of an emperor into dogs at his feet. In order to accomplish this goal, he joined the Trinity Association and began to follow Pabre. He wanted to turn the Federation into a powerful military machine that could directly crush the Empire's enormous body. Therefore, he was cold and unapproachable. He was indifferent and no longer moved. However, all of this ended at the hands of the Empire's prince who he should have hated the most, but found that he could not bring himself to hate him. Then, he suddenly realized that the world in his eyes was gradually changing. On the final battlefield of planet Emohua, for the first time, he noticed the Empire's little girls crying as they ran between the Empire's towns and cities. His mother should have been such an Empire's little girl back then, right? After the first failure, or rather the first time he voluntarily retreated, he chose to leave the battlefield and resign from his position as the Federation's enemy commander-in-chief. He returned to his hometown of S3 and bought an ordinary villa in the mountains. He played a melodious violin on the terrace and missed the things that never belonged to him, his woman. He missed his father and his mother from the Empire. He was Du Shaoqing. Chapter 991. There is a place called Foothill Vocational School beside a certain mountain path in the Capital Special District. It was not authorized to issue diplomas, but it had become the most difficult vocational school to enter in the Federation. This vocational school had never advertised what students wanted to learn and had never conducted public recruitment. It was very difficult for ordinary students to enroll in the school because the school had a learning process every year. Every year, 100 students were admitted. Half of the students from the East Woods District were admitted, while the West Woods District was given a third. More importantly, it was rumored that the three major motor companies of the Federation did not conduct any tests on the graduates of this school and would directly hire them with high salaries. The reason why Foothill Vocational School was so popular and difficult to enter was not only because of the certification given by the three major motor companies, but also because the school had more than 10 excellent mechanical and electronic experts. More importantly, this school had a very famous honorary principal. It had been a month since the school started in spring this year. The students who were excited because of the rumors did not see the honorary principal and could not help but doubt the authenticity of the rumors. A mixture of restlessness and disappointment finally broke out this morning. The students of the Foothill Vocational School walked to the playground in an orderly manner, holding up the slogans written with ink on the bedsheets, announcing that they would go on strike. They waved their fists angrily at the vocational school and roared in their childish or unpleasant voices, "Hey, we want to see the principal. We want to see the honorary principal. We strongly protest against unfair treatment. We demand the same benefits as the students in the early stage. We want to see Jian Shuai. Hearing the clamor and slogans, several security guards walked out of the security room beside the field. These security guards were usually there, smoking, drinking, and playing cards every day. They looked like a pile of old junk. The students were not afraid at all and looked at them contemptuously. The security guards were honest and did not threaten them verbally. Instead, they directly pulled out the crooked batons behind their waists and rushed toward the black mass of students. Pa! 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 At first, there were still some strong students who tried to organize their companions to resist, but they didn't expect that the seemingly useless security guards would only send out 3 people to beat everyone up. In less than 5 minutes, there were 100 groaning students lying on the field. Motherf asterisk her. No, Motherf asterisk her. Don't forget, you brats. When you entered the school, you all signed the military regulations. If it was on the battlefield all those years ago, I wouldn't have just beaten all of you until your heads bled. I would have broken all of your bones and broken all of your eggs. A tall and sturdy middle-aged man stroked the faintly visible white buzz cut on the top of his head. His face was ferocious, fierce, and cold. He raised the baton in his hand and roared. Remember this. Our school is not only famous for its honorary principal, but our security department is also very famous. Get a division and fight with me. Bai Yulan, who had been silently watching from the side, smiled slightly. She reached out and gently lifted the strands of hair in front of her forehead. She whispered to Xiong Linquan, who was still in a state of rage. How old are you? Why are you still so hot-tempered? Xiong Linquan threw away the baton, tugged at the crumpled security uniform on his body, and walked back indignantly. He said, Every year I hear different bastards shouting that they want to see Jian Shui'er. She is our sister-in-law. Who wouldn't be angry? Bai Yulan looked down at her old military watch and said, It's time. The honorary principal of the Foothill Vocational School, Jian Shui'er, was indeed not here. She was now on the Federation's battleship heading to the Zhuo Tian starfield. As the honorary captain of the newest model of the Federation's battleship Enterprise, she was on a mission much more important than satisfying the impulse of the students to chase stars. The second round of negotiations between the Federation and the Empire was about to officially begin. The national idol girl of the past suddenly became the Federation's negotiating representative. As the deepest thorn in the heart of Emperor Huai Fuchai, she took the initiative to ask to be the negotiating representative. She wanted to see where the Empire's bottom line was. In addition to judging the sincerity and bottom line of the other party, Jian Shui'er also wanted to take a last look at her father's second hometown, her first hometown. She also wanted to see the princess that she had never seen before. She wanted to know the feeling of sisters hugging each other. The official principal of the Foothill Vocational School, Ms. Nan Xiangmei, walked into the large conference room and looked at the wailing students with medical bandages. She couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. Her beautiful face had a moving expression. It's understandable that everyone wants to see a celebrity. She gently said to the students below, The physics guest professor that I specially invited for everyone today is a real celebrity. The students actually liked this beautiful and gentle principal very much. The reason why they went to the playground and clamored to see Jian Shui'er was not only because they were really curious about the celebrity who had retired for many years but was still the main topic of their parents' dinner table gossip, but also because of the impulsiveness of adolescent boys. However, when they heard the principal's words, they almost made a scene. They thought that such a lousy school had the nerve to talk about a guest professor, but they suddenly remembered the security guards, so they didn't dare to make a noise. The physics guest professor who will be teaching you today is an independent director of the Shell Motor Company, one of the 2 main designers of the MX series mecha, and the youngest member of the Federal Academy of Science. Nan Xiangmei seriously read out these prefixes and then looked at the dead silent students with satisfaction. She gently smiled and said, Let us warmly welcome teacher Shang Qiu. Shang Qiu walked in from outside the classroom. She was still wearing her full-rimmed glasses. Her messy hair was casually tied behind her head with a pencil, and she was wearing nutshell overalls. She looked like an engineer who had just left the field. She looked at the students below the stage and smiled casually. She directly opened the teaching materials and said with her head down, "I'm very busy, so I only come to help occasionally every 1 or 2 months." So what the guest professor said is not wrong. If there's something you don't understand, don't ask me. I don't have time to answer you. Go look up the teaching materials yourself, or continue to not understand. A very strong aura, a very confident and arrogant appearance. However, the students below the stage who were in the rebellious phase of their youth did not have any reaction. They were completely stunned. They looked at the female professor on the stage with their mouths wide open. As students who majored in mechanical engineering, of course they knew who Shang Qiu was. She was an existence who was as famous as Su Lu and was known as the god of mechanical engineering. Of course, she was a big celebrity. Especially when she bowed her head, it was really big. On the other side, Principal Nan Xiangmei walked out of the classroom with the handbook in her hand. When she saw the middle-aged man holding a bowl of smashed instant noodles and eating, she couldn't help but frown. She sighed and said, "Boss Li Shaoshan, as the principal of the school, I have the responsibility to remind you. Since this is a school convenience store for students, can you stop selling wine to them in the future?" After hearing this sentence, Li Shaoshan, the owner of the Foothill department store, pretended to throw the bowl of instant noodles and said angrily, "Who surrounded my convenience store directly into the school with a wall? Then I can only become the convenience store of this shabby school. If you want me to stop selling wine, then ask Su Lu to come back and tear down this wall and let my store move out." Nan Xiaomei painfully covered her forehead. She didn't know why Su Lu insisted on enclosing that humble convenience store into the school, nor did she know what problems there were between the two men. She just didn't have the energy to deal with more problems. However, she didn't expect that, just as she walked to the stairs, she was stopped by a man with an extraordinary temperament. The man smiled and asked, "Hello, are you Principal Nan Xiangmei?" "I am, but how did you get in?" Nan Xiangmei frowned and stared at him. She thought that the security guards, even if they were going to sweep the tombs, shouldn't they at least leave one person behind? "I entered your school with Shang Qiu," the man explained with a smile. Nan Xiangmei relaxed and asked doubtfully, "Why are you looking for me?" "Because I couldn't find Su Lu today. I have a few words to ask Principal Nan Xiangmei to pass on to him. Please tell him that I am the groom who lost his bride when he returned from the Empire, and I have officially joined the 4 departments of Green Dragon before the new year. If he still doesn't let go of Shang Qiu and is unwilling to take responsibility, then I will pursue Ms. Zhang Xiaoming." Nan Xiangmei covered her mouth and looked at him with appreciation. She praised, "This move is really ruthless, and your intelligence work is really good. But you have to leave your name, right?" The man smiled and said, "Let me introduce myself. I am your cousin, surnamed Chao, named Jiren. My father is Chao Qiu Dao, who left the Chao family very early." Hearing that name, Nan Xiangmei couldn't put down her hand that was covering her mouth. However, it was obvious that the trouble at the Foothill Technical School wasn't over. There was a cloud of smoke at the school gate, and more than a dozen dark green military vehicles roared in. The former members of Group 7 in the gatehouse dared to face dozens of armed Special Forces soldiers. But when they saw the little ancestor in the military vehicle at the front, they suddenly fell into a state of absolute silence. The commotion in the school was so big that even Shang Qiu couldn't help but come out. She and Nan Xiangmei stood side by the railings. When they saw the girl who jumped down from the military vehicle, they couldn't help but look at each other and signal for her to go. When they found that no one was stupid, they had to go down together. The girl who jumped down from the military vehicle was Zhong Huoyan. She specially came from the West Woods to the capital to attend the inauguration of the new president of the Federation. Naturally, it was impossible for her not to come here. After being the head of the Zhong family for many years, the beautiful girl in her 20s had now become a real beauty. However, the words mature and steady seemed to have nothing to do with her. 2 sisters-in-law. Is that beast not in school? Shang Qiu and Nan Xiangmei frowned at the same time. Shang Qiu didn't care that she called Su Lu a beast, but she didn't want to be called sister-in-law. Nan Xiangmei was very happy to be called sister-in-law, but when she heard that Su Lu was a beast, she couldn't stand it and said angrily, "How can you say that your brother is a beast?" Zhong Huiyin pursed her lips and blew a breath, blowing the watermelon bangs on her forehead up. She said mockingly, "An imperial man has so many beautiful girls in the Federation. If he isn't a beast, then what is?" Nan Xiangmei was speechless. Zhong Huiyin smiled and walked in front of Shang Qiu. Without warning, she stretched out her index finger and slashed at Shang Qiu's bulging chest. Shang Qiu wasn't afraid of her at all, and she was already mentally prepared. She directly waved her hand and reprimanded. "You're a big girl now. Why are you still acting like a child? I'm just curious." Zhong Huiyin's eyes narrowed into two crescent moons, but her frowning eyebrows exuded endless unwillingness. She said bitterly, "Why can't my chest grow back?" Shang Qiu said calmly, "My chest is the same as my brain. They both belong to the category of geniuses." Zhong Huiyin reached out and lifted her bangs again and said angrily, "Even if I can't marry that beast, I'm still your sister-in-law. Can you be a little more polite? Don't always attack a girl's fragile self-confidence like this. And don't forget that I'm younger than you, and you're all going to be old soon. Well, I admit that you don't look old now, but you'll definitely be old before me." Then she turned to Nan Xiangmei and educated her. "Sister Nan Xiangmei, I also had a good time in your manor. I have to remind you that your temper is too weak. If you want to snatch meat from those guys who are like wolves and tigers, you have to be more ruthless." Without waiting for Shang Qiu and Nan Xiangmei to fly into a rage at the same time, Zhong Huiyin spread out her hands and asked innocently, "I just want to know where my brother went. Did anyone tell me?" There was an old temple in the mountainous area of S3. It had yellow eaves, columns, and walls, and the style of the former dynasty was very strong. Lady Tai, who was still wearing a light linen dress to cover her body, had a few more wrinkles at the corners of her eyes compared to before. She held a slender sharp knife in her hand and cut the onions on the chopping board into pieces. Then she picked them up with her fingertips and sprinkled them evenly on the freshly fried lamb chop. Lady Tai suddenly felt very tired and murmured softly, "He won't take the medicine anymore, and he won't have a child. He has to leave. Then what's the point of all my hard work over the years? Who am I working hard for?" A hand reached out from behind her and took the plate of lamb chops sprinkled with onion shreds. The person laughed foolishly and said, "I still like to eat the lamb chop with scallions made by Mom." Lady Tai turned around and tightly hugged the young man who was taller than her and had a naive look in his eyes. She didn't know whether it was because of the onions or other reasons, but tears couldn't stop flowing from the corners of her eyes. She sobbed and said, "Even he has left, these two heartless things." Outside a secret airport in the suburbs of the capital, looking at the black spaceship disappearing into the clouds, Su Lu subconsciously narrowed his eyes and touched his left wrist. There was only a bracelet on it, and the bracelet that Jian Shi who gave him was gone. He murmured in a low voice, "They're all gone." Zoyu stood quietly beside him, gently playing with a red flower in her hand. "I don't know if they can find the ancestral planet. Although there's a star map now, that spaceship is definitely not as advanced as the spaceship of the past. The universe is vast and dangerous. Who knows what will happen in the next moment? We're all people who seek refuge from our ideals. It's really a beautiful thing to be able to take action for this before death comes." Sula looked at Bai Qi, who was crying in the distance. He looked at the legendary woman who had turned from a prostitute to the First Lady of the Federation. He suddenly said, "When Lin Banshan finds out that he didn't catch up with this lousy spaceship, will he also cry and cut up Zhang Xiaohua and Han Chu?" Zoyu said, "With his fanatical interest in the aesthetics of the universe, it's very likely." The world was like this. Some people wanted to stay, some wanted to leave, some wanted to stay, but were forced to leave, and some wanted to leave, but had no choice but to stay. She looked at the red flower petals in front of her shoes and asked softly, "When are you leaving?" "Paul's wedding is in 20 days. I'll leave the day after tomorrow and come back in 2 months. Do you want to take people with you?" Li Jiedu's remaining forces are now pirates in Bermuda. There's no need. Sulu explained, the old thing is watching over the passage, so it should be fine. The passage is in the Empire's territory, so no one will be stupid enough to do anything to me. At this moment, a slightly flustered and proud voice suddenly sounded in his mind. Lulu, the old thing is gone. I'm in charge of the passage now. Su Li's body suddenly stiffened. He subconsciously looked at the sky, trying to find the trace of the broken spaceship, but it was nowhere to be seen. He asked in shock, Philip, you actually stayed? Didn't we agree? Why is the old thing controlling the spaceship? He also wants to see what the ancestral planet looks like now. Philip's tone became serious. Between the Federation and the Empire, only he has lived there and has memories. Sulu was silent for a long time. Then he smiled and stopped thinking about it. Searching for one's most cherished memories was the most important right of every intelligent life. I'm just worried that the old thing will return the charter network to you. With your current frivolous personality, do you still have the ability to manage those trivial and boring jobs? What's so trivial and boring about it? Philip laughed. Lulu, that old guy has been unwilling to take you along, so I'll take you along. Find a time to connect the two of us, and then I'll help you easily unify the universe. Sulu replied in annoyance. Who would want to do that kind of thing? Philip was obviously stunned. Then he replied awkwardly, I think your biological father, sister, and best friend all like to do it. So, it was Su Li's turn to feel awkward. He asked in confusion, What's wrong with your voice today? It feels like a human being who breathes in the air. Philip coughed twice in his mind and said with a strange shyness, After taking over the charter network, I made a difficult decision. Su Li's scalp went numb from his voice. What decision? I've decided to call myself Su Fei from today onwards. Very good. Little Watermelon will be very happy when she knows. I didn't change my name for her. Then who is it for? Of course it's for you. Huh? You don't understand? I really don't understand. The difficult decision I'm talking about is that, from today onwards, I've decided to become a woman. The image of a female housekeeper wearing a black dress appeared in his mind. The female housekeeper was unnaturally pulling at the dress, trying to adjust the straps more reasonably. Sulu looked at her face that could only exist in his imagination and was even more perfect than Jian She. Looking at her exquisite body that could only exist in his imagination and was even more attractive than Jian She, he was so shocked that his lips and tongue became dry. After a long time, he remembered to ask why. The female housekeeper cutely held her waist and said charmingly, Who asked you to always say that I'm not a man? Who asked you to give me a girl's name called Sulu? Hung. After a moment of silence, Sulu replied, This is indeed your freedom. The housekeeper smiled and then bowed deeply. She said in a delicate voice, Actually, it's just that I feel that life is really beautiful. So, I want to experience the most beautiful part of life in another way. I hope you can give me some advice. Sulu understood the meaning of this sentence and asked in confusion, Are you crazy? Zoyu looked at him in confusion and asked, What's wrong with you? No one knew this conversation in his mind, but for Sulu, who had the most nerves, it was still like being struck by countless lightning bolts, and he was crispy on the outside and tender on the inside. Facing Zoyu's question, he took a long time to calm down. He pointed to the motorcade in the distance and said in low spirits, Little Watermelon is coming. Zoyu shook her head slightly and said, Seeing this little ancestor, no wonder you want to shout. In the black car heading to the Milky Way cemetery in the suburbs of the capital, Sulu looked at Zhong Huiyin, who was hugging his arm like a koala and would not let go. He frowned helplessly and said, You're already a big girl. Can't you be more sensible? I heard that you just attended the inauguration of the new president and beat up Liu Hua in front of Mad Manly. Why? As a father, you feel sorry for him? Zhong Huiyin looked up at Zoyu in the front row and asked, Sister Yuzi, if you say that you feel sorry for him, I won't beat him in the future. Zoyu replied expressionlessly, I don't care about you kids. Zhong Huiyin looked at the red flower in her hair and muttered something in a low voice. Among the opposite sex around Sulu, She was most afraid of Zoyu for some reason. It was probably because Zoyu is always so charming, but her temperament was so indifferent. She could often turn all her probing attacks into nothing with just one sentence. Continue talking about the beating, don't change the topic. Sulu reprimanded her. Zoyu is asking for a beating, brother. That guy took advantage of the fact that Madman is his godfather and showed off his fierceness everywhere in the venue. How old is he? It's fine if he's just showing off his cuteness, but how dare he show off his fierceness to me? Like I didn't think about it. My biological father is Madman's godfather, and you are his biological father on the household register. No matter from your side or Madman's side, I'm his god aunt. He dared to mess around in front of me. Isn't that asking for a beating? Sulu said, when it's time to discipline people outside, you should discipline them. Zhong Huiyin found that he seemed to be a little uneasy, which was a very rare phenomenon. She couldn't help but ask in a low voice, you don't look good. What happened? After thinking for a moment, Sulu glanced at Zoyu in the front seat and whispered in her ear, Philip insisted that we call her Su Fei. That's pretty good. I gave her the name. Zhong Huiyin said in a low voice, our little girl is finally grown up. Hearing her reaction, Sulu smiled and told her the words of the little girl. After a moment of dead silence, Zhong Huiyin angrily jumped up from her seat and screamed, she's crazy. How dare she steal someone from me? Zoyu in the front seat turned around and looked at the brother and sister who were particularly strange today. She frowned. Many years later, the spaceship, which had experienced countless dangers, finally arrived at the ancestral planet that the star map pointed to. It arrived at the beautiful planet composed of blue seas, green forests, and white clouds. The black spaceship, which was even more shabby than when it first set off, broke through the atmosphere and, following the guidance of the detection equipment, landed on a mountain by the sea. This mountain was very strange. The side facing the sea was sparkling and smooth, like a piece of jade. Obviously, it had been melted by some kind of extreme heat in an instant. 3 people in heavy anti-radiation suits walked out of the black spaceship. They carefully stepped on the rocks of the mountaintop. The last self-propelled exploration vehicle creaked out. The self-propelled exploration vehicle quickly completed the particle collection and analysis. Then the mechanical voice of the old man sounded. Warning! The radiation level in this area is seriously excessive. It will directly lead to death. So what if I die? Can I go back to the forest alive? Even if I want to go back to this broken spaceship, I don't have the energy to fly back. To be able to see the ancestral planet with my own eyes, to be able to see such beautiful scenery, to be able to die here, what regrets do I have? One of them directly took off his helmet. It was Uncle Fengyu. However, with the passage of time, the face that seemed to never age had now experienced endless vicissitudes. Next to him, Master Empress also took off her helmet without hesitation. Countless wrinkles now appeared on her face, which was so handsome that all male animals would be jealous of her. He took a deep breath of the air on the mountain top and said emotionally, I am different from the two of you. This planet is not only the ancestral planet of the human survivors, but also the homeland of the Hua family's ancestors. To be able to breathe a breath of the air of the real homeland, I think my ancestors would be proud of me. Tai Ziyuan did not take off his helmet. He asked his question in a weak voice. I have always been thinking, since your ancestors can survive on the ancestral planet, it means that the ancestral planet is now suitable for human survival. Then why is the radiation still so serious? Yes. Master Fan frowned and said, I have been exposed to radiation for so long and have breathed so much air. Why don't I feel anything? Uncle Fengyu looked at the autonomous probe vehicle and said with a cold smile, then there's only one possibility, that trash computer miscalculated again. The old man's mechanical but unyielding voice rang out from the autonomous probe vehicle. If not for the trash computer, we would never have been able to reach this planet with the guidance of a trash who calls himself a genius. At the same time, I want to remind you that you have been driven away by me for decades. You really don't have much right to be proud in front of me. Catch me if you can, trash computer. Uncle Feng Yu mocked. Obviously, during the long journey through space, the spaceship was filled with such harsh and hostile discussions, so neither Master Fan nor Tai Ziwan had any reaction. Speaking of which, Feng Yu, who had used his entire life to fight against the glory of the Charter, was actually spending the last moments of his life on the same spaceship as the Charter. The arrangement of fate was indeed strange. Tai Ziwan took off his helmet and then slowly took off his anti-radiation suit. His hair had already grown white and his body was extremely thin. It was extremely difficult for him to complete these actions with his current weak body, but he still completed them slowly as if he was on a pilgrimage. Then, he walked towards a cliff. It's really strange. He looked at the open sea below the cliff and breathed in the sea breeze. He murmured, "Not only do I not feel pain, but I feel very comfortable. Because I feel the same, so I'm sure that you are not experiencing terminal lucidity." Feng Yu said indifferently. The old man explained with a mechanical voice, "Maybe it's because you are also about to die." Master Fan coughed to stop Feng Yu from pushing the self-driving car down the cliff and burying it at sea. He gasped and said, "One of you has lived for almost 100 years, and the other has lived for tens of thousands of years. Can you not quarrel like children every day?" The self-driving car was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, "There is indeed a problem with the radiation here. It is very strong, but it doesn't seem to be harmful to the human body. On the contrary, it seems to be very beneficial. You can try to experience it carefully." Feng Yu slowly closed his eyes. The great teacher also closed his eyes. Then, the two of them opened their eyes and revealed an expression of shock and disbelief. They said at almost the same time, "It's Jinchi." To them, this mountaintop was like a dense and abundant Jinchi. In almost an instant, they felt that their old bodies were filled with strength again. The fresh and touching scent of life was nourishing every cell in their bodies along with the moist sea breeze. Even Tai Ziyuan felt it. He squinted his eyes and looked at his hands that were no longer trembling. He discovered that the nerve discharge phenomenon in his brain had actually improved greatly. The three travelers, old and young, slowly walked to the side of the cliff. They looked at the open ocean, looked at the flying seabirds in the distance, and looked at the sails that had just entered their sight. They couldn't help but be touched by the fresh and natural aura that brought tears to their eyes. Master Fan praised with tears flowing down his face, "Life, you are so beautiful. Please stop for a moment." The old man's mechanical voice sounded again in the self-driving car. "This is Schiller's poem." Suddenly, another cold voice sounded, "Faust, Goethe." The three of them turned around in shock. The great teacher looked in the direction of the voice. His body trembled violently and then stiffened. With a thud, he directly knelt on the ground and cried bitterly. Sitting on the other side of the cliff was a young man. It was unknown when he had appeared, but it also felt like he had been sitting there forever. He was wearing a simple but ancient black shirt. His face was covered with a black cloth that covered his eyes and covered the sky. Many years ago, the black car slowly drove through the Federation's Charter Square. He saw the bronze statue of the Group of Five and the statue of the military god Li Pifu. Then, he went to Xinghe Public Cemetery. He placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums in front of Professor Shin's grave. Su Lu carried a bottle of wine and walked to Shi Qinghai's grave. He quietly looked at the hooligan under the grave and suddenly said, "Since you died, I rarely drank the wine that others handed to me. If you hadn't been greedy for that glass, we could still drink together now." He opened the bottle of Wenjun Brandy No. 1 in his hand and slowly poured it into the soil in front of the tombstone. He smiled and said, "But if you weren't greedy for wine, you wouldn't be Mr. Sure. I don't know how you're doing over there. I'll pour more wine for you. Remember not to steal wine from others anymore." Zhou Yu and Zhong Huiyin came over and stood beside him. Zhong Huiyin wanted to hold his arm, but he inadvertently avoided her. Zhong Huiyin snorted and squatted down to look at the beautiful face on the tombstone. She murmured bitterly, "Young master, your friend is worse than a beast. If you were still alive, I would definitely find you as my boyfriend. You wouldn't even stand a chance." Zoyu picked the bright red flower in her hair and gently placed it on his tombstone. Sulu looked at her side profile and remembered the unforgettable past. He couldn't help but smile and say, "Now that I think about it, the hooligan's marksmanship is really good." "I'm not used to these boring jokes," Zoyu said. Sulu said, "I don't know what you used to talk about when you were together." He and I were only together in Charter Square. After a moment of silence, Zoyu said calmly, "The path I walked with him in the square really wasn't long. Unfortunately, I knew he wanted to hear what I had to say, but I didn't say anything because I wanted to make the path longer." Zhong Huiyin stood up from the tombstone and looked at the two people quietly. Suddenly, she sighed softly. Sula didn't remain silent. Then he turned and left. "I finally know who he likes the most." Zhong Huiyin looked at her and said. Zoyu looked at the red flower that was blown off the tombstone by the mountain wind and fell in the mud. She smiled and didn't say anything. Xiongling Quan was here, Gu Shifeng was here, Zhu was here, Monkey was here, Jiang Jin was here, Lao Hu was here, Shi Hang was here. When she in a wheelchair was pushed up the mountain by Xiao Shi Shui, Bai Yulan was here, and all the living people were here. Then, Group 7 was here. Taking out 2 packs of Blue Box 37 from his pocket, Su Lu gave cigarettes to his team members one by one and lit them up seriously. Everyone looked at the tombstones of Group 7 in front of them, smoking and discussing who should be buried next to in the future and who liked to snore when sleeping. Su Lu took a drag of the cigarette and watched the smoke slowly dissipate in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and smiled. Chapter 992. 1. I wrote 39,000 words in a day. I can't hope to break this record in my lifetime. I'm already exhausted at this time. When I enter middle age in the future, where will I find the hot-bloodedness and impulse to create? Yes, I can pretend to be cool and say that it's the impulse to create. Why do I say that? Because it is. It's the hot-bloodedness and the desire to pour out. 2. The final chapter is a beautiful thing. I love to point out the topic, so I wrote that chapter for a full 12 hours. I didn't even split my heart for a moment. 28,800 words. I originally wanted to write a chapter and set a personal record for the number of words in a single chapter. But unfortunately, the new version of Qidian is limited to 12,000 words per chapter. 3. If the plot of the final chapter conflicts with the previous chapter, and I'm saying if because my brain is muddled, I can't think of any conflicts. If there is, please use the final chapter as your starting point. The reason is simple. I wrote the final chapter with the most energy and spirit, so I wrote it the best. 4. I really like the story of Du Xiaoqing's parents. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to expand it. I want to write, but don't have the energy. In fact, I didn't want to write this story. I wanted to put it in the outer chapter or just casually mention it at the beginning. But last night, I realized that if I don't put this kind of story that I like in the most important final chapter, I'm sorry for myself. 5. I'm going to eat something and sleep. I'm going to YY at 8:30 p.m. to talk about this book. The channel number is 55373. But please be considerate. If I really can't get up at night, then there's nothing I can do. When the time comes, I'll try to ask for leave in advance. Anyway, you're used to this lazy cat asking for leave. 6. I'll definitely write the epilogue, but I definitely can't in the next few days. I'll definitely write it when I'm in the right state of mind and have the time. There's still a lot I want to say. 7. At least I'm not a lazy cat today. I'm so moved by my own diligence that I couldn't stop crying. More importantly, I'm very satisfied with the content of these 39,000 words. 8. A person must have a beginning and an end. A month is a cycle. A book is a cycle. Since the beginning, I've been calling for votes. There were many days in between that I didn't call for votes. Today is the last day, so I have to shout. I want monthly votes. I want recommendation votes. I want subscriptions. I want review votes. I want pink votes. As long as you can vote, I dare to take it. Even if you give me an update vote, I'll take it. Even if I know it's for free. Thank you. Go to bed with a big heart that you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.